We are in Marshfield at Twin Valley, Twinfield Union High School. And I'm Stephen Morse, the chair of the state board. And we're going to start our meeting as we usually do with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We need someone to lead.
We'll go around the table and let the board members introduce themselves, starting on my left here.
Oh, that would be me. I was thinking it was going to be Sean Murray. Bonnie Johnson-Aiton, Montpelier.
Dylan McAllister, Greensboro.
Morgan McIver, right here.
Stacy Weinberger, Burlington.
Sean Marie Oler, Bennington.
Stephen Morse from Newfane.
Rebecca Holcomb, Agency of Education.
Bill Mathis, Goshen.
Peter Peltz, Woodbury.
Krista Hewling, Jeffersonville.
Mark Perrin, Middlebury. Thank
you all. If for those that are guests of the meeting, there is a sign-up sheet over here. If you haven't, in the back, pardon me. If you haven't signed in, please do. The next order of business is are there members of the public that wish to be heard? Yes, sir. Please come up to the front table. We haven't heard from you in a while, so we're glad to see you here.
I can still be short and sweet. Good morning. My name is Rama Schneider. I'm from Williamstown, Vermont. And I want to start with a question here. It's what are you willing to do or let happen that is going to be different? And I asked this, and I thought it was appropriate for today because of at least two items that are on your agenda. One of them is the North Bennington School, and I realize this has to do with expanding some of what it covers. But I do remember the discussions on the state board, and it created a fair amount of angst and some issues. You'll also be talking about the adoption of physical education and health standards. And on the Agency of Education sheet, if you flip it over in the back, it says cost implications, none. And I also, just the reality that nowadays we're delving into a process of providing learning experience for our state students that is on a bottom-up model. We deal with a very complex public education system, there's no doubt. It's a mix of federal, state, and local mandates, preferences, decision-making. Back when Act 60 was passed in the 97, I remember thinking that, this funding education is going to be really great. It's going to open the doors for some original thinking on how we deliver education because we're not going to be locked into the money. The money's going to be there. It's what you do with it and that is going to matter. Unfortunately, half of Act 60 dealt with what you could call educational quality standards, which was a long series of prescriptions that told you what you were going to do at the local district with the money that was provided. At Williamstown town meetings, I spent the better part of the last half of the 90s and the early 2000s saying that we could do it cheaper in Williamstown on a budget, but we had to be willing to do things very differently. And I still believe that today. At the last school budget meeting that we had in Williamstown, I remember asking the administration, what were they going to do that was different, and how was that going to affect the money and the educational experiences of the students? I'm here to ask that same question. The Agency of Education is obviously represented here, as well as the State Board of Education. What are you willing to do or let happen that is going to be different despite your own personal preferences and beliefs as to what is going on? I am glad that money is helping to drive this discussion. It is going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of districts. The spending per equalized pupil is a very imperfect number to use, but regardless, I am glad to see it helping to drive this conversation. But if money's going to help drive the conversation, you need to give the local schools, the districts, the leeway and the ability to do things differently their way, whether it's a North Bennington answer that says we need to really radically remove ourselves from the public education system, or it's to allow a small school district to prove that they can uphold the quality standards even by offering few classes. So I'll just leave it at that. You know, what are you willing to do or let happen that's different? I thank you for your time.
Are there other members of the public that wish to be heard this morning? Not seeing any, we will move on to the consent agenda.
So moved.
Jean Marie has moved approval of the consent agenda, which I believe has, we've got a revised. Give me a moment. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Seconded by Bill. And I believe, I'll find it quickly, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 issues on the consent agenda. Is there any, Jean Marie?
Are you going to ask for discussion?
Yes.
I typically would be asking a number of questions. I still have those questions, but I'm going to ask later in the meeting if I could roll my comments and discussions into the agenda for the retreat coming up. I do believe that with the new legislation, 361, that we really do need to take a look at how we move forward, how we assure the new EQS, which is also going to be part of our conversation. So I will be voting in favor. I appreciate the Agency of Education's couple of visits to the add-on in terms of assuring special ed. I do think that is a question that we need to talk about as a bigger picture. But since some of you know that I often have questions about the independent schools and particularly ones that are close to home, I will not be asking them specifically today.
Thank you. In that the consent agenda motion is normally not debatable, I appreciate you putting your comments off until later in the agenda. Not seeing any other comments, those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no. And the consent agenda has been adopted. Item D, announcements by board members.
I was lucky enough to attend the Smart Start Conference in Greensboro, North Carolina, 2 weeks ago. It was a multi-day conference, 1,100 people from 38 states, including 35 Vermonters, which was exciting. And it was a conference devoted to early education systems and strategies. So especially for Vermont, for me, it was very exciting to kind of see what a lot of other states are doing as we look, especially towards the pre-K rulemaking process. And in particular of note, there were a lot of interesting applications for how some other states have had some real coordination between their different agencies. So, say like much health and education, or other things that Vermont is doing as well. But it was interesting to see North Carolina, Oklahoma, some other states taking some real leadership roles in that. And it was people from Reva Murphy was there, Julie Coffey from Building Bright Futures, a lot of other regional coordinators. So I thought it was a really great opportunity. I was excited to go.
Thank you. Peter.
Rebecca, Morgan, and Dylan and I were in the State House talking about student voice, particularly in regards to Act 77, with Helen Beatty's group of the students. And I don't know if you all have. I thought it was a very strong. It was a very busy day for the legislature. There were 2 legislators there, but I thought it was very productive and very strong. Do you want to say anything?
There were just several schools from around Vermont that have been working together with youth and adults to make change in their school and use everything that Act 77 offers them. And that was just our sharing of to everyone in the State House, like, you helped this happen, so here's what we're giving back. All these wonderful, engaged students excited about their learning.
I think what was special about it was that often when the state legislators pass some sort of legislation, they don't really get to see what comes of that, and this was a really great product of all the work they put in Act 77. So.
And the presentations, it was all videotaped, and so that exists on the internet,
Somewhere.
which I can find more specifically.
And it's gaining national attention.
I would hope.
Other comments from board members? Bill?
Went to the EQS training, and we're going to hear more about that today. And I was impressed by it was very well organized, very well presented, and I think with the new law, it's going to take on even more importance. And I think, and we'll be talking about this at the retreat, I'm sure, but I see this as the linchpin of the entire operation. But we'll have this discussion as we go along. Spent some exciting times and trips to the legislature over the past month. It was quite the experience. And also attended our monthly teleconference of NASB on the federal legislation. Things lurch and then they freeze for a while, lurch, go forward, and so forth. I'm still reasonably optimistic about the federal directions, but we won't see that until it happens.
Other board comments? Okay, we will move on.
Sean Reedy.
Oh, sorry.
I attended the EQS summit with Bill, and I too was amazed at the energy and the organization of that 30 people in that conference room that we meet in Barrie. It was pretty impressive, and lots of ideas, and honestly, I don't know how they're gonna, or Amy's gonna sift through it all. It's a big job. So I look forward to the next one and what we end up discussing and how we can use it.
Can I tag on to what Sean Marie said?
Sure.
This capacity problem is very important. We're going to be talking about it today at the retreat and we will continue to, but I'm terribly worried about it. It's a huge agenda for which there is very little capacity, and it doesn't make a lot of sense for the legislature to pass a very expensive law and then not support it to the degree that it needs to in order to be successful. It's early in the game. We'll see what happens, but capacity is going to be a very telling issue.
Let me follow up on that as well. I've spent a fair amount of time in the legislature in the last month or so. Bill and I go together so we can really kind of watch each other, and so no one gets out of control.
So the pendulum can go like this.
Yes.
Oh, the burden on both of us is just tremendous.
But we both have raised the capacity issue a number of times before the House Education Committee, as well as the Senate Education Committee and individual members, and certainly talked to the Secretary about it. And as you well know, this was not a year in the legislature with a $113 million deficit to add additional funding. However, I found it encouraging that individual legislators would say to me, "Yes, you're right. We need to get this going," and the capacity issue, with some advice from the agency, obviously, we'll be back visiting this next year. So, it's our testimony was not lost on him, but we were not successful in convincing him that the agency and/or the board needed some staffing to handle what's going to go forward. But it did not fall on deaf ears. So with that, why don't I'm going to skip the chair's report, and I'm going to go to F, but I'm going to say a few words before we get into F and turn it over to Rebecca and Jill. I'm sure that there's a lot of differences of opinion on H361 in the room, but from all the years that I've been involved in public policy issues in various capacities, I think H361 is probably the most legislation I've seen passed in my time. It's really historic. In my opinion, as you well know, long overdue. The last time we revised our educational governance system in the state of Vermont was 1893. We went from some 3,300 school districts down to the 277. And I think we're at that same type of juncture, maybe even worse now. And as you know, the board has certainly been aware of the financial discussion and the need for changes there, but we've really focused on the inequities and trying to find equities in the educational system in Vermont. This is not a perfect bill that was passed. There'll obviously be some needs to go back to the legislature and add or clarify items. But in my opinion, this is an extremely important piece of public policy for the state of Vermont. Whether it's not just education, it's how students find jobs and many other capacities. I have not had a lot of time in detail study what was actually passed. We'll spend some time on that today, and we'll spend more time on that at the June retreat. But from my point of view, at this juncture, we need to, with the agency, come up with a plan of how we're going to start making this work this summer. We need to, some of my thinking is that maybe we actually either form a committee or the full board travels around the state getting input, making suggestions, again, but with the agency, not necessarily on our own. But I think we need to be very aggressive about this to make it work. There's, I guess 4 years before it fully goes into effect, but that's only going to happen if we start the process now. And I think we're, again, with the agency, a very important ingredient in all that. And I think by the end of the retreat, we need to come out of there with a strategy and a plan of how we're going to handle this. This is important to the state of Vermont. So, with that lengthy introduction, Madam Secretary, you can take over. Jill, we're glad to see you here today.
Nice to be here.
Feeling better?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Jill Remick, Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs at the Agency of Education. I know when you don't feel well and then you feel better, how much better you feel. I feel like $1 million this morning. So there are so many things that happened in the last few weeks of the session, and we're still digging through. We're working off of the latest versions of things we could find. I think obviously we want to spend the majority of the time that we have, about 45 minutes or so, on H361, but there are a few other things I was just going to quickly mention to you folks first.
Let's do that first, yes.
So S44 is a bill that reallocates the dual enrollment caps. So what that is the 3 state colleges each had a cap of 18 students. And what happened when the high school students from across the state were taking advantage of dual enrollment, some of those state colleges hit that cap right away, but then there were others at other state colleges that went unfilled. So now they're sharing that total as long as the total still adds up to 54 students. So there's that piece of that, and then also S44.
Can you explain what that means to share the total? What do you see happening in terms of
So
redistribution?
right now, I guess right now, because it hasn't actually been signed into law yet, each state college, Johnson State, Linden State, and Castleton, were allocated 18 spots for high school students to participate. Early college.
Yeah,
Early college,
It's
I'm sorry.
early college, so they
Early
have
college.
to unenroll from their high school and they go to
Sorry.
college. Right.
Early college, big difference. So there was a cap of 18 students at each of those state colleges from high school who could come and take advantage of early college. And the Vermont state colleges were the ones asking, because I can't remember which of the state colleges, but one of them hit that 18 and then had to
Johnson hit the
turn
18.
students away. And then at Castleton, I think they didn't reach that cap, so there were actually slots that technically could have been used. So those have actually been, and this was at the request of the state colleges, so they're now a total, as long as the total still is 54 students.
Jill, do you know when that kick triggers in terms of timing?
I think it's July of this year, but I can.
Yeah, but in terms of once the enrollment figures are determined, and then that it becomes, the commitment.
Yeah, we were worried about how they would do that. At what point do you start to turn students away or start to,
Opening it up,
Right.
yeah.
So there's some implications there we're still working through.
You mentioned dual enrollment. I realize that's not
Yes,
exactly what you're
it's-
talking about.
That's next.
I actually got a call. Are you going to get to dual enrollment?
Yes, but by all means.
I'll
Okay.
wait then.
And then a second piece in S44, which was another bill that had been traveling through but got added to S44, is establishing a higher education savings fund for every Vermont student. So through a combination of investment money that is this commission will be fundraising for, it basically establishes a higher ed savings account for all Vermont students for and I think it's a 527 or whatever it is. It also requires the agency to distribute financial literacy information to students and their families. So that it's an aside, but it certainly continues to support the goal of more students having aspirations beyond high school. And it also, we made sure that the language they used about financial literacy reflects what's in education quality standards. That's one of the transferable skills that we really want students to have.
Can I, there is, you can, is it VSAP, the VSAP, you can invest in it's like an annuity in your children's or grandchildren's. This is different, is that correct?
Well, it will allow families can contribute to this in addition, but basically it sets up, I think it's $250 a year, starting when the child is born, that's invested into this fund, and then they can withdraw it for specific higher ed, but the families can add to that. Yeah.
2,500, yeah.
So today, in about 2.5 hours, the governor's hosting a press conference at Burlington High School to explain to folks the change in the budget bill about dual enrollment. So starting in FY16, the way that when Act 77 passed in 2013, starting in FY16, 50% of the cost of the dual enrollment participation was going to be borne by the local school district. And we were also concerned that that was actually starting to become a disincentive because that could possibly be one of the reasons why we're seeing the numbers, they went up and now they're starting to go back down. So what we in the governor's office advocated for, and which did pass in the budget bill, is that we'll be using off the top of the ed fund some flexible pathway money to make up that other 50%. So it won't be that the school districts are getting billed or that they have to submit funds. I mean, not only would it be an accounting issue, but it's also, it could be a subliminal or not so subliminal disincentive for students to participate. So now the districts won't have to be responsible for that, meeting that 50% match for dual enrollment, which we hope will continue to encourage more
Is that
students
just
to
for
take
this fiscal year, or is that a
in
public?
perpetuity. It
ongoing.
changes,
Ongoing.
it changes that
Repurpose-
section of
repurpose
statute.
the flexible pathways money.
What I started to tell you before, I got an irate call from Newport from a mother whose daughter had gone through the dual enrollment program last summer before 77 went into effect, and her son had applied, and had heard nothing and couldn't get any information from the high school, and the suspicion was that the local funding was the issue, so.
Okay.
I can now call that mother back and
Yes,
take full
and
credit
please send
for,
anyone like that our way, too.
You solved the problem.
Yeah. Please send those our way, too. We want to make sure
We've
that.
been,
And I did.
Jill's been working also to communicate out through our staff to districts so that every principal and superintendent knows that this is through and
Right. So
be a state
there's the
obligation.
big press conference today, and then also tomorrow in the field memo, we're sending out a pretty detailed memo to the field to really make this crystal clear, because, students are signing up for these now. So that's good news.
Just on this S44, there's been issues about kids coming from poverty and the costs that are incurred to either take dual enrollment at early college that isn't provided by the tuitioning aspect of these.
There was a small appropriation to VSAC to support things like textbooks.
There is?
And things like
Yes.
that.
And that
for
was,
kids in poverty.
is that separate, or was that a?
It's a separate, it's in the
actually
same
in the-
section of the language, but it's just a separate line.
Yep.
But it is in there and it guarantees an additional fund
Right.
to
Thank you.
provide support for high poverty
Textbooks,
kids.
transportation, things like that. Yeah, I think it's 50,000, I want to say.
Yeah, I think
Great,
it's
thanks.
50,000. But it's in addition to some matching funds that they
Right.
have or something.
VSAC manages that.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of other little nuggets we continue to find in the budget bill that we are working our way through. One of them is tobacco funds, and I don't know how much we really want to get into the details of
Not
this.
at all.
Okay. Yeah.
Talk about it.
We have lots of other things we got to get through. I have a big stack of paper.
I think he's got a conflict of interest.
All right. Share your information.
So moving on, so H 480.
You can go ahead and talk about the tobacco.
Well, no, just, as is the case with this session especially, there were some pretty significant budget cuts, and they were happening in all different agencies and different areas. And so we have an independent tobacco evaluation and review board. Their funding was cut, and so there was some language written into the budget bill that reallocated some money that goes to the Department of Health and the Agency of Education to replace that money that was cut. So that will mean that we will not be able to provide as much money in grants to schools for tobacco cessation. But they continue to meet about that. They're trying to find other ways to, we just got a note this morning, they're gonna be meeting about that again tomorrow, because it doesn't really help anybody's cause to have that be the outcome. So we're still working on that, but, do we want to talk about Community High School Vermont at all?
Yeah.
Just there was also, this little phrase was added into the budget bill that could be construed as expanding the mission of education for Community High School Vermont to include students who are in diversion programs, which is an additional language. They're not just simply those that are in the custody of corrections. So that's a little concerning. We just are really hoping to
It
work
actually
with.
says other students, including students in diversion, and so it's not just kids who have been adjudicated, it's also maybe close associates of kids who have been adjudicated. So it expands their mandate to include non-adjudicated youth.
So in other words, anybody.
It could be
It's like
construed
an
that
adult
way.
ed program. It would function like a
Well,
parallel adult ed system.
But it has been working like that in some of these
I was
Well,
gonna
there was an
say,
agreement that they wouldn't, and there, because we have a robust adult education program already, and, I guess it's just a question of where you want people educated.
Did the community high schools budget get cut?
It did initially.
Not as much as it was initially proposed.
did
is my
they close
understanding.
any sites?
I don't believe so. But they may, because so many of the agencies just sort of had these figures that they were given to cut. I don't know what their plan is for meeting that, but my understanding is that initial proposal to close the sites did not go through. So H 480, this feels like Groundhog Day. There's been language that I've brought to you folks for several years, and that we've brought to the legislature for several years. Feels like several years, I suppose it's only been a few. To realign the statutory language about the State Board of Education and the school quality standards to reflect the education quality standards. And that's simply been in a technical correction bill each year, and it sometimes gets added to, and then therefore this rather innocuous and helpful language doesn't go through. So it's not that the language itself was problematic, it's just simply that that's the process. So we were successful in getting that amended. And in addition, we also, for the past couple of years, have tried, and now we've succeeded to change the section in law related to educational support teams and ESS, systems of support, to reflect the multi-tiered systems of support that is now the current best practice that we've been getting grants for, that schools are implementing. It's in, I think, 34 out of 59 SUs are implementing MTSS. So that's that multi-tiered systems. It's not simply addressing some factions of students. It's a school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, sort of treating the whole child and being proactive in dealing with the culture of the school. It's the way that we want to go and the way that schools are going, and has been really successful. So Karen Edwards on our team had done a lot of testifying on that in previous years, so we were able to get that language through as well. And we got universal support on that language from the Disability Law Project, the School Boards Association, Special Education Administrators. I mean, that's a pretty universally welcomed change. It does not create necessarily any new mandate, but it certainly does codify that that is the practice that we want schools to be going towards. In addition,
Can I
one of,
mention one more? Are you moving on to the next piece, or are you?
I'm still in 480, but.
Okay, no, go ahead. I'll let you finish the 480.
So, earlier this year, or actually probably this fall, Peter Drescher, who's our technology integration coordinator, you folks might have heard from Peter in the past. So he pointed out that if we could just add the word pre-kindergarten to the definition of elementary education in statutory language, which now that Act 166 has passed and we have universal pre-K,
We really should.
is really the way that it goes anyway, that could allow schools to count their pre-kindergarten students to get E-rate reimbursement. So that is a broadband connectivity reimbursement funds from the federal government. So it's no cost to the state, and it frankly is not only reflective of what schools are needing, but it allows them to draw down more federal funds for E-rate. So we were successful in getting that one word put in there, which has pretty helpful implications for schools, because we know that pre-K is expanding, those head counts are growing, and it allows schools to count those kids in their head count as well.
Is there an estimate of how much additional funds that'll bring in, or is that
I'd
too
hate
early?
to, I'm sure Peter knows, I could follow up with you folks.
It's quite
The
early.
number 5 million pops up, but
Oh, wow.
that could be,
So I guess if it is substantial, we ought to know about that.
right, because it's a certain amount per student, and it's for broadband connectivity, it's a big deal. So I will find out the amount.
There's no equalized pupil on that, right? It's just.
No,
a-
that's heads, the
It's
county
heads.
bodies, yeah.
Right.
Part of what we're doing is just, I mean, it's been interesting, we've learned a ton just going through this process, and what we're realizing is that there are places where we're leaving federal dollars on the table, and this is just one of those. There are a couple others that have come to mind, too, that we're looking at.
Peter probably would think of this on his own, but if it's a substantial number, as you seem to think it is, he should make sure that the Vermont Telecommunications Authority knows about that, even though we are only going to be in existence for another 45 days or so. But the Public Service Department, who's taking over that, will want to know that. So that, Peter's
I'll let him know.
appeared before the VTA before, and he probably will think of it on his own, but in case he doesn't.
Okay, I will
that's-
definitely
That
let
would be
him know.
important information.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we also were able to, and this I believe was in both 361 and in our miscellaneous technical corrections, we were able to insert language that allows the agency to, and the state to count, to use supervisory unions as the entity for accountability determinations. So we can talk about that a little bit more probably when we get to 361. And it also establishes an after-school and extended learning opportunities commission and fund. I'm sure you folks have heard from Holly Morehouse and Emmanuel from our team about expanding after-school opportunities. This basically establishes a place so that when they go out and can apply for grants or get federal funds, or basically there's no state money allocated to this fund, but it gives them a place to put it if they can do some fundraising and get some grant money. So we will definitely be working with them closely on that.
Part of the concern is that at this point, the only money going into that is federal funding. And we're concerned with reauthorization. That was one of the original items that was going to be taken out. And if that goes through, or if that had gone through, that would basically eliminate all support for after-school programming or summer learning in the state of Vermont, which we think is a tragedy. So the purpose of this was to start to create a shell that we could use to begin to build up some alternative revenue streams that might support pre-K and make us a little less vulnerable to fluctuation at the federal level. The good news is that 21C money is back in the reauthorized draft, so we're hoping it will stay in, and Senator Sanders has been instrumental in keeping it there.
So two other quick ones, and then we can move on to the meat of the meal. S9 was the child protection bill, which got quite a bit of attention and had lots of testimony and input from DCF and from our agency. We were a little concerned for a good deal of the time. There was a new crime put in there that while the intentions were good, it might have had the unintended consequence of really being a deterrent for folks who work directly with children, because it essentially created a crime that if someone should have reasonably known that the child was being exposed to abuse and did not report it, that would be a felony. So that was a concern for a few reasons, and also we made sure that those folks know that teachers and anyone who works with students are already mandatory reporters. So that was covered under existing law. We have to continue to dig back in there and see exactly what did come out, but our understanding is that piece was corrected so that it was not quite as damaging as it could have been. for folks who do work with students. Lastly, 138, S138, it's an economic development bill, but there's certainly a piece in there that John Fisher, I think, is today John's last day?
It is his last day.
That John Fisher worked really closely with the Department of Labor and Workforce Development. There is a piece in this economic development bill about our ensuring that career and technical centers are given or continue to be supported in offering courses and training in those high demand, sectors. So I need to continue to dig through that one, but that was something that John had worked on really hard, so we think that's a really good thing.
Can I ask, is that for general population, not just student age?
I believe, it makes sense that it's for the general population, I believe, yeah.
In terms of access to the priority pathways?
Yeah, in other words, is that eligible to adults as well?
Oh, I think they are, but the different pieces of the work would be done, yes, but it would be done through different wings. So the schools will have their priority pathways, and for example, the CTE centers, there's adult learning. We're trying to align the work of the CTEs, the adult learning program, and then the
Right.
folk rehab, and so they're all working in the same pathways.
Right.
But there might be different modes of delivery for different populations, depending where they work. I don't know if
Just know
it's-
that the CTE directors realize that they have open time and that can be utilized by,
Some of them are moving
I know,
actively in
yeah,
that direction
yeah,
already,
yeah.
yes. And that is the intent. It
Thank
also
you.
gets better use out of the facilities,
Yeah,
frankly.
that's what we-
Bill?
A couple of questions before we get into the wonderful part of the agenda. Is John going to be replaced?
That's part of my report. We're going to,
We'll defer that question. Do you have-
yes, yes.
He'll
That's
never be
very
replaced.
important, of course.
He is, but, I mean, I can digress now if you want, but.
Why don't you
yes.
wait? Why
Okay.
don't-
Okay. The other thing I think is more of an observation than a question is if the district moves to the unit of accountability and the reasons for that, one of the things about using a district as the accountability thing, when the unit gets larger, it begins to hide some inequities that can happen within the district at the school level. No matter what solution you get, there's pros and cons to each of them, and I recognize that, but
I think we're aware of that. I think this is specific to federal accountability.
yes.
So, and we are in a situation where we're calling every single school in the state a low-performing school, and the logic behind this is just to tell 60 SUs that they're low-performing instead of telling 304 schools that they're low-performing. This doesn't preclude what we're doing with respect to state-level work around education quality reviews. So these are different systems. We're not saying that we're only going to look at the SU moving forward. We're just saying for the purposes of federal accountability, we already know we're all low-performing, so let's just
Okay,
do it 360 times instead of 277 or 305.
the key word is that federal piece. Okay.
We know we need to use the and truly, if we are successful with reauthorization, we will have more responsibility and more flexibility locally to develop a state model for accountability, which allows us to really focus on the kinds of concerns you're talking about at the school level. Our point is, let's minimize the effort we spend on, non-core work and focus our effort, the scarce resources we have, on the developments like the education quality reviews that we think are going to get the greatest lift for our schools. So this isn't to erode that. This is really to free up resources to focus on other purposes that we think will get better work for our schools.
Okay, thank you.
Just to be clear, this is focusing on federal. And there's some other pieces before we move on. I mean, one of the other things that came up is that one of the challenges of statute is that it may move forward in one arena, but forget some of the corrective technical adjustments that have to happen in other statute that depends on the piece that was modified. And one is with 153, for example, we have moved all special ed to the SU level, but there are other places in statute where it refers to district level determinations, which is, if you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense, because if those services are administered out of the SU, why would you ever evaluate a local district in terms of whether it was high or low spending, because really it's an SU level function. So I think what we're doing in 480 is trying to just slowly bring those lagging pieces of language in line with what current practice is as well. So just in terms of the SU, we're also going to look at, we had tried to move some of the language around special ed to that level as well. So that when we make decisions or when we interact with districts or with SUs, we're doing it around the work they do, not the work that's being done by somebody else.
Donna's usually very good at that.
She is. Unfortunately, it doesn't always, when people are really busy,
Oh, I know.
doesn't always
I know.
get through. I mean, they're wonderful. Donna's been absolutely wonderful.
She's incredible.
Yeah,
I
she's
mean,
amazing.
the volume of stuff that she turns out,
And those side-by-sides.
yeah,
Oh.
is just incredible. I mean, we might even pass a resolution on her in here sometime.
I would hardly endorse that.
Bill.
Speaking of Donna, so I'm not sure if you folks got electronically. There's sort of a 2-page, real short. I think I sent these to Carrie just yesterday because
That's dated 5/14 draft?
Yes.
That was given to us today,
Great.
and there is a longer version out there as well. I
That's
believe.
right. Which is
Isn't that under Senate Ed documents?
Yeah. So they're the latest document that's actually the full text of the bill that the conference committee signed is the latest version that we have to work from. We have not had a chance as the agency to actually walk through all of the pieces. So I certainly hope, next month or at your retreat, we can, we've scheduled a block of time for us at the agency even to
We're counting on that, yes.
to walk through and pull out the things that the agency and the board is really being assigned.
Yes.
Not only explicitly, but implicitly, there are all kinds of things that are asked of districts that mean
Yes.
that create work that we need to make sure gets done.
Is there a
So-
signing ceremony that's been scheduled yet?
Not that I've heard.
We will know, though.
I'm sure, yep. So yeah, so I'm working from, if it's helpful, the 2-pager that Donna had created that, as Stephen mentioned, says draft, and then there's also this longer, it's probably 10 pages that gets in a little bit more detail.
For now, why don't you stick to the 2 pages?
I know, I don't want to hold it, we're good. So some of the big takeaways from 361 that we've been able to extrapolate. It gives the school systems that need to make changes some tools and incentives to do so. If you're a small district, it gives you an opportunity to partner with other small districts to achieve some scale. It allows some districts who are ready, who are poised and ready and are made up to do so, to move quickly. That also gives us sort of a focus group or pilot group that we can really find out what works, what doesn't work, where savings and program improvements can be found, and then we can share this with the other systems that are thinking about it. As you know, there have been some, several successful conversations in different districts. We have the examples of all the different articles of agreement, which can be very different depending on where you're looking. This will give us a bigger pool of examples. It also allows those systems that are already working well, it lets them stay that way. It leaves them alone. If they're working and are efficient and effective and are providing students high-quality opportunities, it doesn't force something that's unwanted on them.
Can I interrupt for just a second? You talked a moment ago about the larger schools that might be in a position to move forward sooner rather than later, and this may be premature. But one of the dangers there, I would think, is that some of the adjoining school districts might get lost in that process, and that in the future there may not be an easy solution to where they go.
Well, that's where you folks come in.
So, I just raised the issue, so, yes, we need to encourage people to move forward on this, but we need to be careful that, that adjoining or nearby areas are considered.
I think some of the places that might be poised to benefit from this might not be the ones that you would expect. Just going to say that. So I think the question is what locals decide in terms of what makes sense for them.
Yep, and everything will go through you folks in the agency in some capacity. And yes, at the end, starting in 2020, the state board is empowered to reassign if necessary. For districts that are still considering this, they'll have more time to review their situation and review the data that we hope to have from the education quality reviews. It assigns a great deal of work to the state board, but it also gives the state board some of the information and guidelines that they need to help those really small districts or other places that really need to consider working together, some options. And it also has a good deal of, towards the end of the bill, there's a great deal of cost containment and tax incentives and penalties to really try to meet the legislature's assignment of reining in spending. So it really puts pressures on systems to control their growth and per pupil spending without just simply a blanket cut or cap that may not necessarily actually cause the right kind of change. So the goals that they've outlined in this legislation are to move the state towards more sustainable models of education governance. It's designed to encourage and support local decisions and actions that provide substantial equity in the quality and variety of educational opportunities, lead students to meet or exceed the state education quality standard, maximize operational efficiencies through greater flexibility to manage, share, and transfer resources with the goal of increasing district-level student-to-staff ratios, promote transparency and accountability, and are delivered at a cost that parents, voters, and taxpayers value. So that's language from the goals that the committee put together. It outlines preferred structures for governance to, sort of ensure that there's a critical mass and that what we have found and what the vast majority of districts can fall into that would allow for greater equity and opportunity for students. It allows for alternatives to that structure if it's really not going to meet the best interests of the students and the school district and the state. The small school grants was a topic of a good deal of consideration, lots of changes and ideas thrown over time. And the state board does have a role in determining annually the parameters for folks being eligible for a small schools grant. If a district or districts are considering consolidating, they can continue to receive the small schools grant as a merger support grant. We also spent a good deal of time talking about the hold harmless provision, that phantom student tail. So the way that when Act 60 and Act 68 passed and they created this phantom student provision, it was really to protect districts from pretty wild fluctuations in enrollment. What's happened over the years is that the enrollment has continued to go down more like this. And the way that the structure was put in place, it was a 3% protection, but it was based on the previous year's number. So basically, if it continued to go down, you were basing that 3% on a number that included those phantoms, so it sort of continued to exacerbate that disconnect between the actual enrollment and what the school was getting, was counting as their enrollment. So this takes that off. This basically removes it makes the 3% based on the actual enrollment, and then it phases out over time. There's a great deal of tax incentives, and as we said, the small schools grant, there is funding in there for transitional, for transitional costs. It also extends the eligibility for REDS, the regional education districts that were put out in Act 153. I'm going very quickly through all of this, I apologize.
Want to interrupt and ask a question of the Secretary. Do we have the capacity to administer those grants coming out of the chute?
Well, one of the reasons we were pleased that they took the Senate timeline is it doesn't require systems that aren't intending to make changes to do work and then demonstrate it up front, so that the Senate version staggers implementation. So we're assuming that we will never have more than 10 systems at a time trying to be processed by the agency. So one of the reasons we were pleased that this version went through is that we think it's easier to support implementation of this in a quality way.
Okay.
We're
Can I
assuming it will
follow
be
up on
staggered.
that?
You really have several waves of incentives, and depending which package an individual system chooses to opt for, it's going to put them in a different place in the queue. And then at the end, we'll have much better data, and really districts will have a chance to make their proposals or make their case, but we'll be dealing with a smaller number.
But they've added additional incentive to jumpstart this in that first year.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea how many are maybe
You mean
prepared?
July 1 now?
Yeah, those are systems that have to
that
have a
have-
vote
Yeah.
within a certain time frame. So there's a limit to the number of systems. Those are those are systems with a pretty high level of commitment or an ability to organize themselves quickly. And we assume, just from what we've heard preliminarily hearing from the field, you can ask some of the stakeholders in the audience, but maybe 6, 7 districts that might take advantage of that. And the logic there is really to create, we've already been starting to reach out to some economists to help us think about how to analyze it, but the logic is to create a sample so that when we're talking about what works, what doesn't work, and where opportunities are, we can actually build it based on some Vermont schools and examples and not based on, national data, for example.
Thank you.
But there's no new appropriation. This comes out of the Ed Fund.
No, it all comes out of the agency's budget. You're talking about the, for the incentives for the mergers?
Yes.
That's coming out of the Ed Fund, yes.
So the State Board of Education will be reviewing proposals to form either union school districts or one of the preferred education districts that are outlined in the Act. The State Board is asked to ensure that when reviewing those, that those are reviewed through all of the goals and requirements that the language lays out, including a piece about ensuring that there are socioeconomic considerations taken into account.
What's the time frame for that?
Let's see. Well, the union district piece could be anytime, I suppose, but let's see. I think it's 2019. Yep.
7/1/19.
Yep.
The House version had a section that had the board coming up with merger criteria by the end of this year. That didn't make it into the final bill, is that correct?
I don't think it did, but one of the things we were going to suggest is that the board take some time to think through what criteria would be, what recommendations you would have for successful mergers. And I would also encourage, Sean Marie called it a rubric. Bill, you've been quite active around socioeconomic equity, but in terms of really outlining what your priorities are in terms of equity, but doing it in a deliberate, thoughtful way so that we can anticipate any unintended consequences and make sure that when you're having these conversations and you're making recommendations, it's done so with full cognizance of all those possible implications.
Well, this is what I was talking about.
I see that as retreat. I would do that regardless of what the bill says.
So what I proposed at the beginning of us working with the agency and setting this up and getting the process moving, you're in agreement to do that.
Yes, and I think we would be happy to support.
In the minutes, Barry.
Right. We'd be happy to support and work with you at the retreat. I mean,
Yes.
that assumes
Yes.
that you're going to give the retreat time to look at some of these issues around
It
equity.
may be the whole retreat.
That means that we need at least the broad concepts of EQS or what that evaluation would be like now,
Well, I think we can.
within the next month or two, I mean.
I think those conversations are unfolding, and part of the purpose of those conversations is to get broad public input and to debate, because these are actually not, there are a number of decisions, none of which have been made, but the process of debating the decisions really forces us to clarify our understanding about what our goals actually are and how you might operationalize them. We have to go through a series of hard conversations to get there. I think what we could do at the retreat is look at what the pivot points are and really push on them to understand as a board, when you talk about measuring equity of opportunity, what does that actually mean, and how would you actually know it if you saw it? That's actually harder to operationalize than it seems at first blush. And I think Amy will give us a peek into that today, wherever she went. She's on the way back. But that's a conversation I think we need to continue and really dedicate some time to.
Okay.
So back to your question about the criteria. So the legislation outlines the sort of black and white enrollment size, preferred structure, so on and so forth, for both the preferred structure and the alternative structure. And then it also outlines in the goals at the beginning, in I think it's subsection 2, that the state board review any of those that come before them through those lenses. So there's the sort of hard black and white checked data points, and then there's the more subjective piece that the state board is asked to review each one through.
So if you define the criteria with respect to equity, then part of what you would use to review it is that template, for example.
Is it still the case that the local groupings can form any kind of contractor structure that they want?
Anything that's in law.
Those agreements.
Anything that there's
In their articles of agreement, you
a
mean?
fair amount of
Yes.
flexibility, yeah.
And doesn't the agency have models of those?
We've put up models on the website of samples, articles of agreement, because districts have handled their local organization differently in different consolidation efforts.
Well, that can be a curse and a blessing.
It can be a curse and a blessing. But the point is that even with the district, I'm not talking about school consolidation, district consolidation, there's still tremendous room for local difference in terms of how you organize and operate.
So also, if a district or districts have not organized or sort of put their stake in the ground and gotten the okay from the state board to stay as they are, there is another section that requires them to have a self-evaluation, host meetings, and then they would actually still submit a proposal to the state board that either they are retaining their current structure, or they're going to form a different structure, or that they meet the goals. So there's
What section are you reading from there?
that is section 9. So I'm using the larger one
Yes,
now
I
because it
understand.
has a lot more pieces that refer specifically to the board's duties. So I'm trying to pull out the board's duties. So on page 5 of that
Yep.
larger piece now. So by June 2018, the secretary will publish and submit to the state board a proposal that, to the extent necessary to meet the goals of section 2, which are the goals about, you know, not the black and white goals, but the more subjective goals, would move districts into the more sustainable preferred governance structure of an education district as described above. So there's lots of branches to the tree. They all end up at some point coming through the state board. Let's see. So the state board will review and analyze the secretary's proposal, take testimony, ask for additional information from districts and SUs, and either approve the proposal or approve it in an amended form. The state board will publish a plan that realigns district as necessary. Let's see. All of these pieces do not apply to interstate school districts, career and technical education districts, of which there are 3, or unified union school districts that have merged between now and 2020.
So who would that include, that third bullet?
You wouldn't subject Chittenden East, for example, to another one.
Or Rochester?
That's not a merger. Rochester's an SU, it's not a district merger.
That's
So
the
that-
one where Dan French is.
Bennington,
That's used.
So what I'm hearing you say, that there's only one such example.
Yeah, unified union MUD, that's, I wish Vaughn were
Is that
here, but
my
I think the
correct?
idea is that if there's somebody who's already in the process or has just done this, that they're not necessarily held to the same level of,
but it
same
may
rigor.
also, and it may also have to do with your size. I mean, I think the MUD puts themselves over, I forget what the threshold is in the final version, but I think it's 900.
900.
So the logic is that there's a certain scale that if you achieve it, you're going to get some efficiency. I mean, one of the things that came out, it's interesting, actually, that you mentioned the Mountain Towns Red, and one of the things that as we plumb this, we find more and more issues, and one of them is it wouldn't change the total amount of federal money we get for Title I, but Title I allocation across districts is done by the number of eligible students in your district, and they count differently than we do for state purposes. And our very small systems, you have to have a count of 10, and that's not real people, it's their formula count, to be able to drive federal dollars. And many of our small systems are below 10, so their students are not getting access to the federal title. They're not driving the numbers to drive the volume within the state to their region. And so as people get larger, they are able to draw more of the federal funding to their system than they would be as a very small district. So the Mountain Towns Red, for example, this year is drawing more federal funds. It doesn't change the total allocation to the state. What it does do is redistribute it across the state to areas where those students are, and maybe they haven't had access to them. So there's a lot of volatility here, I'm just going to say, and that there are hidden costs to size that I think we're not always attentive to.
And throughout this process, the language requires that the secretary will regularly keep the board apprised of conversations, votes, mergers, studies, any other data that we collect through the education quality reviews or others. So there's going to be a pretty regular conversation that'll probably be part of
Sounds
your
like a
monthly
regular agenda item.
Yeah,
Yep.
this is basically your next 5 years.
It
Those of
does
us that are here
authorize,
5 years.
it does authorize a limited service position for the agency, but only if there can be outside funds that are found to pay for that position. So for right now, you're stuck with the team you get.
So just before we get
We're
off,
looking
one of
for
those
that.
exceptions was regional technical school districts, the CRSN.
Yes.
They've been completely held harmless.
The 3 of them have.
Currently, the ones that are not
Yeah.
affiliated.
And I don't know, what are the 3? Do you know offhand?
Springfield, Bennington, and
Middlebury.
Addison County.
And you find that unfortunate? Oh.
The one to your left does.
That's yet another one of those, the more you sort of dig in, there are districts that are considering conversations that might be a part of two different CTE regions. There's lots of layers to these conversations, and that's something that example I just gave is something that they'd have to work out in their Articles of Agreement. You'd hate to have that be some sort of a deterrent. You don't want to take away options for those kids that are already able to take advantage of that. There are some financial incentives and extension and of the eligibility grants, financial incentives that were given to the agency to provide, any joint activity or other incentives to put this into account. The state board will annually determine the small school support grant eligibility. Ones that operate a school with an average grade size of 20 or fewer would automatically be eligible to receive that. And that requires the state board to adopt and publish the metrics of that by 2018. We already talked about the tail. The yield is a taxation issue. It's basically reflecting on the I won't even get into that. Basically, the idea was to make it more transparent as to what a dollar spent sets the base homestead rate at $1 and then shows the adjustment based on that. The idea is to be more transparent about how the tax rate is determined and what that money buys the school districts. And that requires a good deal of work from the Commissioner of Taxes to examine and report out on. So let's see. So if anyone's following along on the longer page, I'm on page 11 now. There's a good deal of work here that is about the state board. As we talked about earlier, you folks have already established the education quality standard, and we've really been using those as the lever with which we really want to be measuring performance and outcomes and also opportunities that are given to students. So this language really reaffirms the existing authority that the state board already has, but then it also allows the state board to require two or more districts to consolidate their governance if by 2020 they haven't, and the state board and the agency have determined they have not been meeting these standards. Let's see, Section 41 would it clarifies authority for districts to ask the state board for an SU boundary change if putting another district into a different SU facilitates the merger of the petitioning districts. I think you folks have seen that come before you already. This clarifies that. We already talked about the SU as the federal accountability LEA. Let's see, on page 12, there's a series of reports that the agency will be responsible for.
Among other things.
You folks might remember there was a paraprofessional study that was done by the Joint Fiscal Office. This
yes.
special education funding is a piece of that. As we testified to, we would be doing this work over the summer and in the fall regardless, because we really do believe in the work that was uncovered in that study, and also the work that Michael Giangreco, who I think has come before the state board, has addressed about how we can maybe change the way that we deliver special education and the use of paraprofessionals in a way that is incentivizing the right kinds of interventions for students. Section 47, the principals and superintendents' responsibilities. I think this originally came about when we were not sure where this bill was going to go and what the different roles are. We will do our best to, we will certainly be working with our partners on this. It may be that depending on, the goal of this request changed as the session went on, because the responsibilities of a principal or superintendent might have changed. But now that that's been set, I think the idea is really to try to affirm the superintendent as the CEO of that organization, and to clarify what the roles are for the board members, principals, and superintendents, which is going to be probably more important than ever as more of these conversations start happening and they involve several different boards, different supervisory unions.
I think it reflects that probably, especially given the high levels of turnover at leadership levels within systems, but also at the school board level, that it probably doesn't hurt to sort of lay out what some of those responsibilities are, so that when new people come in, they can quickly orient to what the job is, but to do that in a systems-wide way. And then the other reality is they are different in different kinds of systems.
Right.
It is different to be a superintendent in a large SU than it is to be a superintendent in a large SD. And you're going to have different kinds of, you're going to spend your time on different things of necessity. So to be able to sort of articulate that so people understand the car they're driving would be helpful.
Section 49, the Agency of Human Services and the Agency of Education Coordination, we've really started to really see the need for serving students at earlier and earlier ages, and there's data from DCF about how the opiate addiction epidemic is actually really having a huge impact on students who are in DCF custody. You know, the 0 to 5 population of those students, or those children, is growing exponentially, and those are all kids that are heading into the school system and are really going to need those supports. So this
That's why they cut $617,000 out of the budget that was going to a Southern Vermont opiate center.
I think that was the very reason.
So, you know, we can.
You can put that in the minutes too if you want, Perry.
Was that an editorial comment?
Yes, it was. Wasn't a question, that's for sure.
And, you know, we've seen, we want to make sure not only, I think our child nutrition team does this outstanding job, and the people at the schools do an outstanding job of doing so many things for the students who need this. And it can only help to really, rather than look away, to really look towards how we can really help these kids, and it'll make a huge difference. You know, it also dovetails really well with the pre-kindergarten service. Again, that's probably the first place that a lot of those kids are getting what they need. So the more that we, as the two agencies, can work together and try to find ways to use the existing channels, and feel free to elaborate, Rebecca, if I'm botching it, because I know this is something that you care about.
Can I say something? I'm just going to sound like a broken record, but I really do think the community rating system should be reinstated.
Well, it's funny you say that, because we we had an initial meeting with AHS, and that was the piece that came out, was how could we use our collective data sets to do a
Right.
joint community rating system that really spotlighted some of the challenges. And we've also talked about reaching out to public safety, because what we're seeing is the public safety data is actually an incredible predictor of what we're seeing in both the human services sector, but also in education. Going back to the representative on my two to the left, I mean, one of the things we see is the juvenile incarceration adjudication rate is very, very high in your area, for example, and that also manifests itself in the schools.
And the teen pregnancy.
And the teen pregnancy.
And it really
They're very
coordinates
related.
resources as to what's happening on the family and the student front at the school, and that's
Right.
really.
Well, and the new AHS, I don't know, secretary, director, I'm not sure what his title is, was at the Children's Integrated Services Conference, and he talked about the numbers of TPR, teen pregnancy, or the termination of parental rights has risen, as well as 20% more kids in DCF foster custody, and we don't have enough foster parents. I mean, it's just, it's layered and layered.
And it's, you know, I have a couple statistics I'll show you later, but it's layering at every level. We no longer have enough facilities with seats for kids who really need to be placed out of their school systems because their needs are so intense. We also don't have residential placements at this point in many regions of the state. So these kids are being held in place in facilities, in schools that really aren't able to provide them with the support they need. So it's happening at every layer of the system, and the need is more intense in the younger cohort, which is what worries us. And are we ready for that? So we know we need to respond to this. And it's across the state. It's not localized to certain communities. I think that's a common perception.
Just Bennington.
It's not just Bennington. It's every-
Section 50, Jill.
Yes, almost done. They did put in a $300,000 ed fund appropriation to the Joint Fiscal Office to study adequacy. This was a request of the House. There were several members who really felt strongly about this. I think this was a olive branch. And as Rebecca said many times, we are an equity state, we're not an adequacy state. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this, and that's actually a pretty sizable amount of money to allocate in this bill for.
Comment and perhaps a question on this is that there are some people that are pushing for an adequacy study as a way of reducing the amount of spending we're doing in education. But when I look at the AHS thing and the discussion we're going to have about gaps in poverty and what's happening there, I think that we may find out that what we're funding and doing for kids in poverty and for ELL students is probably way less than what it should be. And if we're serious about these gaps, we're going to have to look at this adequacy question in a completely different light. And I'd also ask the question of you folks who know these systems better than I, do we even have the kind of cooperative system that we need in human services and AOE combined to pull this off? Maybe we need to be thinking about a completely different kind of model.
Well, I think that's a really I mean, what you have just done is tried to redefine the term adequacy from how it's typically used in the school funding debate. And I think what you're saying is
They're
that,
trying to redefine it.
well, I think they would like to know, bottom line, what can we say is what it costs to educate a kid? I think what you're saying is that how much it costs to educate a child may be a function of what their circumstances are, what they bring to the table.
Certainly is.
And in that case, you might say that what's adequate for one child may be different than what's adequate for another. That's not what typically adequacy studies do. So if the board defines what it understands to be adequacy, then that's something we could certainly present to the consultant who is doing the study and have them evaluate it through that lens as well.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. Because we do provide some technical assistance and support, and I think it's a real question.
I think they're misusing the term adequacy from the finance literature.
Stacy?
We'll talk about it.
I'm just going to jump on. I think when I read the summary and, the variety of newspaper coverage, this was the part that really alarmed me. I was like, whoa, what is this about? I guess I was wondering where EQS fits into that, if anything, and yeah, I have similar concerns. It really jumped out to me as something substantially different than everything else we'd been talking about. So whether it's an olive branch or a sidebar or an I don't know, there were lots of pieces, but I was wondering about EQS, because I think we have already, we've already defined what, where we want to be. So I'm wondering why we're doing that again.
Well, because but I think it's because we haven't perhaps resolved the real issues. I mean, just to go back to your point, we know that when kids enter school, we already have a profound achievement gap in every measure that we would use to look at student performance. We know that 2/3 of what we call the achievement gap is developed in outside of school time. Are we saying that to meet EQS, high poverty schools need to provide summer learning opportunities to every child? Then that would be our statewide metric for quality learning. But we don't make the same request of high-income schools, do we? And those parents wouldn't want summer learning because they want to be able to send their kids to camp. So, I think we have to really think about what we're asking of systems with different circumstances. And how we do that in a
Do you
fair
think
way.
that's the intention behind this question?
I think that's the intention behind Bill's formulation of the question. I don't think it's the intention behind the way this was formulated originally. And I think, and my point is, it's actually a much more to be fair, you have to approach it in a more complicated way.
I agree.
My understanding was in the late in the House deliberations, this bought a few more votes on the House floor.
But it is $300,000, so we should get something.
Well,
for it.
and just so you know, Bill and I seized on this when we were in the Senate and said, look, the House has shown some willingness to give the agency some money, so why don't we take this $300,000 and instead of doing this study, why don't we hire 2 or 3 people and get going on this? And obviously, we didn't get very far with that argument. But
Thank you for asking.
I thought we were fairly persuasive, but
I would have thought so.
And then finally, the Director of Healthcare Reform is doing a study in a separate, there was a separate bill specifically about healthcare, and they just wanted to ensure that there's a specific attention given to school districts, SUs, and employees of the supervisor. So this is very broad strokes, very rough. I appreciate your kindness knowing that we have not, there aren't even final versions of a lot of these bills published yet. And even as I was sitting waiting, Brad James is back at the agency sending me, oh, and don't forget to mention this, don't forget to, there's so many pieces to it. So I do hope that either, at a future meeting, if you want someone from the agency to come back, or if you folks have
no,
period
well,
of time.
I can tell you definitely at the board retreat, I think we're probably going to spend, I haven't heard from the agency yet, but a fair amount of time in the board retreat on this legislation. So I think you and Brad, with the secretary, ought to be thinking in terms, and whatever you can get to us in advance, or whatever you can bring to us at the retreat, that'll serve as a beginning of the conversation. Unless the board objects, I think we ought to leave that board retreat with some kind of plan on how we're going to start working on this legislation. Peter?
I just make a general comment that I was very pleased in terms of the inclusive process and the conference committee and what we got as an end result. I think it probably is the best of what we have seen throughout this whole situation.
Yeah, clearly, it's better than it was at H83.
Yeah.
Coincidentally,
I've been I've been reading. Maybe it helped that I wasn't there.
That was the subtle point I was making.
However, I've been reading the Cromwell books, the account of, and there's a great line in there is that the quality of laws is how people believe in them. And I think that's going to be our role in this.
Wonderful.
And it's going to be critical. There isn't going to be one size fits all. This is going to take a lot of scrutiny at the local level and to make it work. And I think we're all up for it, but it's going to be a lot of work.
Bill?
Is somebody drafting the great wall chart of the Venn diagram or whatever, or the flow chart of all of these thousands of activities and how they fit together?
Well, that's why we had Ben Doyle coming later on to present about the Vermont Arts Council, because you can do the picture, right?
At the very least, a timeline.
That's what I wrote down here, just because it's nice to see what's coming and what's going, just a timeline of all the dates.
Whatever you
Really
can bring
helpful.
to us at the retreat, I think will be very helpful, or whatever you can get to us in advance. So
We also need to articulate what it is we want from them.
Why don't we take a couple minutes at the end of the session later on to do that?
That's a good idea. Yes. Well, there's an agenda item later on today on the board retreat, so I would ask you all to give this some thought, and by the time we get to that agenda item after lunch, that we might be able to provide some clarity. But we also need the professional and position that you all have at the agency.
We'll do it. I think the hope of that last session was to get your priorities so that we spend the bulk of our time on what you care about, and I think one of them will be the equity issue.
Right.
So
And I guess I also would encourage you to reach out to the so-called educational partners and what they might want to contribute, is because it's my intention, although it's a long trip to southern Vermont, that they would participate in this conversation as well.
I'm sure they'd welcome that, yeah.
So. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to see you're feeling better.
Thank you.
Where is it?
Okemo. Ludlow. You know where that
Your
is?
neighborhood.
Almost. Good biking there. Secretary's report.
You're trying to rub it in.
Take a break? Sure.
Yes.
Great idea. We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
We are on item number G, the Secretary's report. So I'll call on Rebecca.
All right, and Rebecca's going to be quick because we're behind schedule already. So, first of all, a couple questions came up. We have successfully posted John Fisher's position, and we are actively recruiting right now for a new deputy. Certainly, one of the things I will say about John is he had an unusual portfolio. So we don't expect to necessarily find an individual who maps over his particular portfolio. So there may be some reshifting of priority.
He really did have an interesting.
It was an unusual portfolio. He'll be hard to replace. So there may be some shifting of responsibilities as we look at who the candidates are, what their respective strengths are, and how they line up against our current strengths in-house. But we are looking forward to moving that process as quickly as possible.
Let me add one thing there before Rebecca moves on, that as you know, in this budget crisis year, a lot of positions in state government were eliminated. And from the administration's point of view, the easiest place to eliminate positions is when they were vacant. Rebecca very successfully argued with the administration to fulfill this vacancy, and she should be congratulated and appreciated for that.
Argue or negotiate?
We negotiate. They've actually been very supportive of
I'm
us.
not sure what she gave up to get it, but
Nothing yet. No, they were very supportive of that. I think Jill gave you the full debrief of the legislators. I won't retread old ground, but the other pieces that came out of that were there were some implications in terms of hiring and staffing, and one of the challenges we've had is we haven't had sufficient general fund to fully fill all our positions. So for example, one of the reasons the rules review has taken so long is we had to outside contract that because we were taking the funding from that position to support the Act 166 implementation in the transition. So one of the good news outcomes of the legislature is they did allow us to repurpose the EEI grant, which had historically given grants as they were incentive or innovation grants to districts that wanted to launch a pre-K, and will now be able to use some of those resources for other items, including specifically to fund the 2 pre-K positions that we need to have to support implementation of 166, but also some of the EQR work and get us back structurally in balance. So So we will be able, hopefully, to fill some of our vacancies that have been open just because we didn't have the general fund to do that. Moving forward, there is a plan in place as people retire from state government, regardless of funding stream. They will only be replaced in a 1-to-4 ratio. So for every 4 retirements, we'll get back 1 position. The challenge of this is I think we're actually the oldest agency because we have a lot of folks who serve in the field and then come to work for us afterwards. We don't know how that will play out, but it is something we're mindful of moving forward, that we may end up come fall having fewer staff in place. And I mentioned that not to worry too much, but just to raise the issue of capacity and say that in the wake of the big changes that have come through, we're spending an awful lot of time internally at the agency, both between John's departure and the new legislation, thinking about what the agency really can do realistically to support positive, strong school systems across the state that meet the needs of all of our children. And not just in terms of fiscal capacity, but also organizational capacity. How are we organized? Where are people working? And is the work they're doing the work that's really of greatest value to our school systems and our children first and foremost, but then also the legislature and the state board? And so those conversations will be going on internally in the agency. And prior to hiring John's replacement, we hope to go through a pretty systematic audit of the current work that we do against statute, what's statutorily mandated, what's required in regulations, including things like the education quality standards, and what we know from experience is really critical core work, just to making our systems operate and be strong. And so we're going to try to make sure that when we lose capacity, or as people retire or move out and we repurpose capacity, we're trying to move our resources behind our core commitments. And really coming out of the recent session and the work around the education quality standards, we're pretty clear that our top lifts have to be supporting the education governance consolidation, so that as our systems enter this period of opportunity and change, we are able to support that and make sure it's an intentional, thoughtful conversation, which really serves first and foremost the purpose of high quality education for all of our children in an equitable way, and does it in a sustainable way. We also know that we need to dedicate what resources we have to improving education quality reviews and to working with you to help define what it is to be a good school and what is the kind of feedback we can give our systems so that they can continuously improve and do better for our children. And finally, we need to support systematic implementation of EQS and flexible pathways. So really those three initiatives, which really do touch every single person in the agency in one way, shape, or form, really will be what we use as our touchstones moving forward.
It would be very helpful if you came to the board retreat with a list or the number of positions that you feel that you would need to adequately cover those 3 areas, and not that necessarily you're suggesting to the board that we do something about that, but if we had that information, we independently could make a decision to solicit funding for that. I'm very sensitive to the fact that you now work for the administration and not the board, but if we had the information on positions, we independently could make a decision and perhaps go to the legislature next year to seek funding for those.
And when I say, and if that doesn't happen, what would the resulting impact be?
Right. And I'm very sensitive to putting you in a delicate position, Madam Secretary, but we do need the information.
I will do the best we can in that time. That's only a month away. I think part of what we want to do is be thoughtful. We do a lot of things that are not required, and what we may need to be able to do at some point is say, no, that's a nice idea, but we don't have the capacity to do it. One example, we support, Jill, I don't know if she's probably gone, but we support, I don't know, how many boards do we support task forces? 20, 24? And we just got a couple more. We have no staffing for any of those. There's a limit to how thoughtfully we can support that number of boards with the capacity that we have. So we may at some point be saying we can't do that. Or some of the reports, what we've been trying to do is bundle some of the reports. So instead of having them just serve one purpose for the legislature and then have to do other work elsewhere, we may be giving the legislature their report, but also most of what we were interested in, so we can do it together and try to combine. So what we're trying to do is achieve efficiencies as
So
well.
unfunded mandates didn't apply to you?
No, it doesn't, no.
Even though they talked about less reports.
So I think what we have to just acknowledge is that the state, I think we have to be, we have to be clear that the fiscal challenges the state faces are acute, and the answer can't always be more money. Part of what we may have to do, all of us, is think about how we do better with what we do have. And that's really the challenge we're taking on in the next couple months before moving in.
Okay.
So I want to end because I want to make sure we save
Yep.
time for this one.
Any questions of the secretary? If not, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just real quick about the teaching licensure, I've gotten several people contacting me and just wondering what they were told that they might not get a license this year, and just wanted an update.
That would very much surprise me.
Okay.
What I can tell, I think there's been some public misunderstanding around what happened. Maybe I can highlight some of that and let Amy speak to it in greater depth. As you know, we were in the process of developing and had just put together a new online licensing system, Alice, that was scheduled to roll out. And literally the month we were ready to launch that new system, there was a change in licensing requirements by the licensing board. The problem with these big online, and Amy will interject if I'm representing this incorrectly, but the problem with these systems is they're very costly to reconfigure. So we decided not to, at Amy's wise counsel, not to reconfigure the system until the new rules were finalized. And that's a year-long process. So we have been sitting on an online licensing system for a year, waiting for the rules change to be fully finalized so that we could reconfigure the system. So that caused the initial delay. But my understanding is that that now is complete and you're
Yeah.
open for renewals.
Renewals are open, and no one should have been told they wouldn't have a license this year. What they may have been told is that they would not have confirmation of their renewal before the expiration date.
Okay.
One
think
more
there was-
question from Sean Marie, then we're going to move on.
It actually isn't a question. I just can't thank Rebecca enough, as Peter and others have said, for your hard work this past legislative session. I don't think you slept, and your family probably didn't see you.
Well,
I still
I would
think you
say
need
that
that driver.
I would also, I just have to call out Jill if she's still here. Jill's in the back, who probably has a cot somewhere in the legislature, and also Brad James, who was, we were, for example, very concerned about the caps, and we understand the needs for cost containment, but we're very concerned about unintended consequences. And I have to hand it to Brad, who is spending a tremendous amount of time thinking through the finances, coming back, on a dime with detailed reports, and really shepherding that process. And there, I could call out a whole group of other people who came in at the last minute to testify at the agency, but really, it has been. We've been, to the extent that we've been successful, it's because we have tremendous people who've done tremendous work, and need to recognize them all.
I think the reason that they were successful in getting the bill through this year was through your leadership and the team you put together at the agency. My crack about former legislators was just a crack earlier. But obviously, I don't think this would have happened if you and your team hadn't been there and given the attention that you gave to this bill. And that's why we not only got the bill through, but we got, I think, a pretty decent bill to start with. So, with that, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, discussion of the EQS update. Amy, we welcome you once again.
Thank you. I do
You're like a
have,
regular visitor.
I'm starting to feel like one. I do have some materials for you, and I'm going to ask you to take one of each as you pass it. One, I'm going to ask for it back, and the other, because I need you to write on it and give me input. The other one you're just going to keep. And then for members of the audience, I'll pass these around in case you want them. There's some duplication, and should anyone want to see the screen, feel free. All right. So I'll take a second to let this go through. One of the dilemmas that we are facing right now is clarifying the difference between education quality standards and education quality reviews. We typically see EQS and EQR appearing simultaneously in the same presentations, and people are using the acronyms interchangeably. So we're trying to work very carefully on discussing the fact that today I'm here to talk to you about education quality reviews. That is the mechanism by which the agency and thereby the board will know how well we are implementing education quality standards. So the standards that came forward in 2013 are the basis for all work we do. The reviews, which have yet to be launched and are still in planning stages, is how we will identify how well our schools are achieving the ambitious goals that were set forth in that plan.
Review.
For today, I want to start with a couple of points. The input sessions, we had the summit back in April. As our first summit, we engaged in 4 activities where members of the field helped us to understand what they would like to see in education quality reviews. We'll be having another meeting coming up a week from Friday. I can't believe it's so soon. Somehow I'm going to be ready for that meeting. But today what I wanted to ask the board's opinion on is something that no one has discussed yet. So this is actually going to be an input-giving opportunity for the board to let me know what you would like to see. And you may not agree with each other, and I may walk out with a different opinion from each and every one of you, and that is okay. All right, so the focus for today. I've given you some current statute language, and there's been some minor changes since H361 went through, but this is essentially the key language that we have. And what I want to draw your attention to first are these 3 lines at the top. And every 2 years, the secretary is to determine whether or not students in each Vermont public school are provided educational opportunities substantially equal to those provided in other public schools. And that's what we're going to focus on today. What does the nature of that sentence mean, and how are we going to do that? And the answer is not known to us yet. So it's not known. So what I'd like for you to do is take a few minutes, and on the second packet that I gave you that has room to write, if you need a
this one
pen,
here, you mean?
the full sheets, the question I'm asking to you is, when you see this, you as a board member, what are educational opportunities? What is that? And what does substantially equal look like in your opinion? And if anyone needs a pen, I have plenty available.
Can I just have it for the fun colors?
Yes.
I was going to say.
I am
I think
always
green.
willing to share for the fun colors.
Now you know why I sat next to her in statistics classes in graduate school.
The fun colors take
Is that
up
you? Do you guys know each other? Oh, I didn't know that.
Statistics first.
I found that out.
Thank you, this is perfect.
That explains
I
it.
need at least
That's why schools need budgets for arts.
You want a
Why schools need
substantially
budget for
equal
arts.
color?
Comes
So I
color.
have 2 questions for
Some
you.
people learning
I'm gonna give you about a minute and a half. But when you think about what are educational opportunities, what are you talking about? And when you think about substantially equal,
We didn't write this.
but we live it. And when you think about substantially equal, what is that? So those are the 2 questions I'd like you to take a few minutes on. To jot. Some of you will take notes as I continue talking. And I am collecting these back from you because I need your input. All right, so if you were to say, what are some educational opportunities you're thinking about? What are the things that are rising on your list that this is what this means?
A variety of course offerings.
Go ahead and just call them out.
Educators with expertise in specific subjects.
Ability to do internships and job shadow, just
Magnet schools.
Access to extracurricular activities.
Equal access as defined by Act 77.
ability to go in-depth in an interest area.
Working as colleagues with adults?
So Morgan.
For a minimum of 3 hours, art, science, music, PE, and civic learning.
Challenge by choice.
The ability to follow one's passions.
They even had find passions that they didn't know existed because they are able to try new things.
Basically, it's the provision of opportunities to learn all of the skills, attitudes, and values that we require, such as those we have on the agenda today.
And when you think about substantially equal, what does that mean?
That there's not much of a difference within school districts regardless of where you are? In southern Vermont might even look like northern Vermont, Chittenden County? Be pretty shocking.
That language is taken from 16 VSA 1, which was a,
You're correct.
I remember it well. It came out of the Brigham decision, and it was, the court had to wrestle with this thing And they basically said everybody must be substantially equal, but they can be different, and each local school can be different and should be different, but they must offer substantially equal opportunities.
And
It was
so
a
what would that
legal
be?
answer, not a pedagogical answer.
I guess I'd put what it's not. So what it's not is being offered one type of English class in high school, and maybe what it is various choice and option, and like Morgan said, passions to explore. So instead of just having English 11, maybe you have Shakespeare, public speaking, like different things.
I think substantially equal ideally would start with the individual and build up instead of starting with a system that pushes down. So you're looking at each student and what a student needs to have equal access, and depending on the student, what they need will vary.
So I would take it so that if whatever was answered in the first question, that in the second question, substantially equal looks like the offerings that you are going to determine are the opportunities in each school.
Anyone else?
There seems to be some, I mean, I think when you think about it, there's a lot of things to take in consideration. I mean, I think you have to think about the demographics of the community. You have to think about what kids bring to the table so that it's not a one, I mean, even some of the things that are suggested feel a little bit one size fits all. And I sort of go back to this idea that fair is not equal. And what we really want to be thinking about is how do we, because if you, I mean, I just think about my school, and when you think about Chittenden County, Edmonds doesn't look like anything in Chittenden County outside of Burlington. So what opportunities exist for my students at Edmonds is really different than what the kids get in Williston. So how do you, that's not substantially equal, I promise you that. So how do you balance that? So I don't know what the answer to this, but I do know that it's pretty difficult to kind of put that into something that, I don't know, I think we should be blowing things up, and we haven't done that enough.
Can I ask
That's my
a clarifying question? When you say it's not equal, what do you mean? What tells you that?
At this point, what I'm really thinking about, clearly with us being in a budget deficit, is just money in terms of what opportunities my kids have versus what opportunities other kids have in terms of being able to go out. Let's just take field trips. So that means their exposure is limited. The exposure that we have, and even within Burlington, the exposure that kids within Edmonds have, because we're downtown versus being outside of downtown, which is really different. So I don't know what equal looks like. I think that's the biggest challenge, and to try to sort of nail it down, I think the unpacking is really more about unpacking what equal looks like, and that's huge and difficult and very complex.
Kind of like to pick up maybe a little bit where Bonnie is and take two students. One student may be tracking towards four-year school, scoring well in SATs, and then you've got another student and that may be wanting to do more with agriculture, saying that they don't necessarily, that they're not going to go to four-year school, but they want to access their CTE. And quite often, the type of learning that's done at CTE is in conflict with seat time in a high school, for example. So that the opportunities that abound for if the CTE is trying to fit the high school's seat time into their schedule, it doesn't always fit well for the opportunities for that student. So that would be, I guess, an example of it not being substantially equal.
Because the opportunity is not there for
The
them
opportunity
to.
is not there.
And we'll take one last comment, and then I'm going to push us to the next question.
I think equal might be the wrong word. I think what we're really talking about is equity, because equal means everybody gets the same, and equity is everybody gets what they need. So we're trying to compare, oh, but what do you need and what does he need, and is she getting the same as him? Well, they're not supposed to really be getting the same because they're individuals. They're two totally separate people. So it's making sure that everybody's needs are being met. They just might not be met in the same way.
Okay, so I'm going to push us to the next question in front of us. And so this is defining the problem with equity, which is exactly what we're talking about. And one of the issues that we have to really grapple with is whether or not we're going to constrain excellence in order to promote equity. So as we move through, if we're looking to compare, are students in Supervisory Union A getting roughly the same opportunities as those in Supervisory Union B? If we assume for the starting point that A has less of those opportunities and B has more of those opportunities, we can act to promote A so that they look more like B. We could act to constrain B to do less so they look like A, or we could do both simultaneously. And this is a true dilemma for us, that as we narrow the inequities between systems, if we do not constrain high-performing or those who go beyond, at the same time we promote the development of those who currently don't have something, it will be very hard for us to achieve equity across the state. And so I understand that we have this identity about building from the individual student up, very important, but we're also charged here with looking at the system level performance across the state. And inequities across the state are a product of multiple things, sometimes not having resources to deliver on something that is a known good practice, but also inequities can exist because there is such opportunity somewhere else that it is a challenge to move forward. So I'm going to take the example of English that you brought up. If we determine that it's important to have a wide variety of English course offerings in senior or junior year, that that's what we decide is worthwhile, and one schooling system is able to offer 6, and another is able to offer 2, we may not find that substantially equal. We may not find that to be equity. But we wouldn't want to tell the system that's able to offer 6, hey, sorry, that's too much. Please bring yourself down to 3 or 4 so we can have greater equity. This is a theme we will wrestle with. I am not saying there is an answer to be had, but I want to acknowledge this is a core part of this problem of statewide equity, is how we achieve better outcomes while simultaneously allowing moments for excellence and beyond what's expected to flourish as well. I saw some reactions from that. I don't know if anyone wants to respond. Some people went, oh, of course, and other people went, that's not right, Amy.
Kind of clarifying. So, because the example that's a classroom kind of example, but if you go back to what are educational opportunities, and I think of something like travel and even international travel. So could you clarify what you just said, if using something that's like outside the classroom, and I'm just thinking of a school like where I work where they run 4 international trips at least every year, and then other schools that don't get to run it or every other year. So like, can you give that example using a non-classroom?
Sure.
Just so I can I just want
Let's
to clarify.
take the travel one.
Yeah.
So your school offers 4 international trips a year on average. We might put that under our extracurricular bucket maybe of activities we referenced earlier. And other schools say we can get to 1, but we can't do more. Would we tell your school, I'm sorry, you can't have 4, you can only, the most you can have in any year is 2 because everyone else can only do 1? Or would we say the minimum number you need to have is 2, have those, if you have more, go ahead. If we say have more, go ahead, we are giving up equity between those schools because we are allowing an inequity to continue. As an example.
Yeah, and to continue on that, I think this highlights the issue around how do you assess competency or proficiency outside the classroom. And that, to me, still hasn't been answered, and I think that's where Act 77 needs probably most of its work.
I would agree with you completely, and it is something I worry about regularly, and we are working on it currently.
My comment follows Peter's pretty well in that the one piece that I find missing up there is a compensatory element to equity. In order for some kids at SUA to be the same as SUB, which we will say has much more free and reduced lunch, they need a new set of experiences, and maybe they need these cultural opportunities, which means that equity could be providing a great deal more for those kids in SUB than the ones in SUA, if you're talking about equity of outcomes. Now, how will you measure it? Not easily. And I don't think, and this is a discussion we're going to have one of these days, is we cannot do that kind of qualitative work and then expect it all to be reflected in empirical, easy to compare measures. It's going to be a lot more loosey-goosey than that. We're still going to have some tests, but some of this stuff is going to have to be professional judgment on quality.
Absolutely, and I would agree with you completely. Any measures we will have that will be quantitative measures that we can collect easily, they're proxies for what else might be going on, but they're not deciding points. So in the same way, when I go to the doctor and I have my blood tested for blood sugar, that gives some data, some information. Whatever the results are will spur additional tests that then determine what my diagnosis might be for any condition. They're not going to decide it from one blood test alone, and we should think the same way about our quantitative data. That's where the field reviews are going to play a really important role in having people go out and test. Do we have false negatives? Are there schools that show up as looking not so good and they're actually amazing? Are there schools that we go see that we think are amazing based on the quantitative data, and when you walk through the hallways, they're not as good as you expect? We can have false positives and false negatives. I think the dilemma for the board, and I'm just going to come back to this piece right here, is that when Secretary Holcomb, God willing for the next decade or so, is the one who comes to you and says, here is my recommendation for what this school system needs based on our on-site visit and the quantitative data we have, the board needs to be comfortable that that data is robust enough to move in a particular direction. And that direction could be continued technical assistance, but it can go all the way to closing an individual school, redrawing SU boundaries. There's some pretty serious consequences that are there. And so what we need to do, and this is why we're coming to you today, is to say, we are on this path to figure out how to make these determinations about system level work that captures from the ground up what individual students need, but also is at a system level perspective, so that you as a board are able to make decisions moving forward. And the hard part about this, it might not be the same people making those decisions in the future, but we have to move forward as if it is.
Can I just say quickly, I've seen it in different instances when this subject has been talked directly with students. You have the college track students who are very reactive, and then you have the other ones that want to take the alternative programs, and it's a wedge issue. And we're at risk if we don't get it right.
Yes. Yes. And so I'm going to continue down this example. I'm going to get to another piece of input. Other things we might ask is not just, is it the system of SUA compared to SUB, but we might look at within an individual system, do we have equity of experience for students of different characteristics? So in this example, we might have in Supervisory Union A, they have 4 trips for kids to go on every year, but do free and reduced lunch students participate in that as much as non-free and reduced lunch students, or is that privileged to one group over another? It's a question. Then we have also, maybe we want to look at subgroups of students in one system to subgroups of students in another system. Maybe at the surface they appear to be equivalent, but when you go down to a disaggregated list, you can actually see differences in how certain subgroups are looked at. So at the agency, we're wrestling with this question of how we define equity, and what we think is that we need to look on all of these different levels, that it isn't just system to system as a whole group. It is also thinking about our subgroup analysis for students, and it is making sure that things don't get hidden. And I heard earlier that we were having the conversation around aggregating up to the supervisory union level. And we've talked about this a bit at the summit, and I just want to say it for your benefit. We have purposely chosen to start at the supervisory union as our first launching point for all data, not because we don't think looking at school level or classroom level data isn't important. We wanted to make sure whatever we start with, 100% of the systems would be large enough that they would have reportable data. From there, we will go down, so it's always possible to go to a lower level, but if we built things at a level where we couldn't report data and we knew we were initiating something where we'd have to leave groups off the table, it wouldn't make sense for an accountability metric. I hope that makes sense. So it's not, when we talk about accountability at the SU level, that's because we know every single supervisory union can be held accountable. From there, we'll go down in the schools and the subgroups where the numbers allow, protecting for student privacy and all of those sorts of things, and making sure we have reliable data. All right, I'm going to push us to the next one, and my slide's going to look just a little bit different than yours, because I always practice, and I realized there was a little mistake. So for those of you who are not stats lovers like me, I thought you might need some help understanding this notion of distributions. So if you've ever heard this conversation about like that's a normal curve, essentially what it means is you take all of the numbers of things you are looking at and you look at their distribution. And so if we were thinking of like really amazing performance on something, that would be over to the left. That would be 3 standard deviations above the average.
Right.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, stage left. But you'd see most of the schools most of the supervisory unions stacking up in the middle because they're forced to be in the middle. And here, average isn't bad. Average is great. It's not a bad thing in any way. What you start to get worried about is the schools that are performing far below that average. And so here what you see in a normal distribution is you see all of our supervisory unions would be distributed around the average, most are average, and the distance between what we would consider sort of a danger zone and extraordinary performance, it's pretty big. The distance, the difference between their performance. I'm going to show you 2 other different distributions and then I'm going to get your input. You might also see something that looks like a skewed distribution. This is a totally different thing. The way you would read this is the vast majority of schools are great. Are really doing a good job. A few of them are really extraordinary, but not that many. But there's this long distance for what could be considered bad. Because the line is pretty shallow, there aren't very many schools over there, school systems over there. But this could be what our distribution looks like. This is a different kind of a distribution. This is called a peaked distribution, and that's where you've kind of stretched everything out and all the schools are lining up on top of each other. And if you were to think about it, if every school had exactly the same performance, it would be a straight line, right? It would be a vertical line, everyone just stacking straight up ahead. Here you see most are average again. The distance to danger is pretty long. Like there's a lot of ways you could not be great, but it's such a shallow line, there aren't very many schools there. And the distance to extraordinary means you could have a school way over here that's amazing. They offer 15 international trips, right? They're way over here. But it's shallow, so there aren't very many of them doing those amazing things. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to 3 different distributions. These are only 3. There are a million others. And you're going to draw one for me. So this kind of puts everyone in the middle, and there's some room on the side. This says, hey, almost all of us are doing a great job, but there's a lot of ways you could kind of fall off the rails. This one says we're mostly in the middle and stacked super high, and there's a lot of different ways you could fall off the rails or be awesome, but really few of you are doing that. So here's the question. You're going to draw for me. What do you think our distribution should look like for anything you think we should measure? So maybe you want to take international trips. What would our distribution look like by SUs? Maybe you want to pick enrollment, opportunities to engage in work-based learning. You pick whatever topic you want, but what's your distribution look like for the state of Vermont at the SU level?
What should it look like, or what does it look like?
What do you want it to look like?
Okay.
What do you want it to look like? Because what you want it to look like will help me understand what you think about in terms of substantially equal.
So are we to choose from these 3, or?
You can draw anything you want. If you want to draw a horizontal line, you can draw a horizontal line.
I mean, you'd want
Draw me
most
a
of your
graph.
schools here.
If you want to talk to a partner to get some help,
We have some
feel free.
vertical lines over here.
I'm positive we have some vertical lines.
That's like such a really long.
But think about where your vertical line would be.
topic is?
That's the statewide
You
district
can.
again, though, so I think you secret.
Great. I've been told you're done with your lines. So here are some things. And I think I'll end up skipping the next one. But I think here's a couple interesting questions that came up listening to your groups. One is, do you believe that there's a different distribution depending on the indicator, or is your belief about equal distribution doesn't matter what the indicator is? So that's really a core thing for us to wrestle with. If we think that it's worth measuring and we want it to be substantially equal, then it really should not matter what criteria we're measuring. It should be, if our goal is about that equal experience, if we say the experience is important, then the distribution should be equivalent for every experience we think is important, every opportunity. So that was an interesting thing to listen to. I hadn't thought of it. Really appreciate the input on that. And I am collecting this back, so feel free to draw.
Well, just, I did 2 graphs, one for indicators, one overall.
Great.
For cheating.
Overachiever.
I will do what I can.
You're limited to
Well,
one
it's
graph.
different because indicators, every single indicator can't be the same, but overall,
She's in school every day. She's a lifelong learner.
He hasn't
made a
followed
dotted
one
line.
rule since we said that.
All right, so you have on your sheet,
Let's
you
pay
have a
attention
little
here, come on.
place that I know, I ask people to talk to each other, it always causes problems. On your sheet, you have a place that says likes and dislikes. I'm going to be talking, and if you hear something you like, write it under like, and if you hear something you dislike, write it under dislike.
And Group A is not corresponding directly with likes, and Group B is not corresponding directly with dislikes.
No, that would be really inappropriate. So one of the things we talked about is that we would want to be able to identify within school or within SU equity gaps and understand the degree to which experiences were not only the same across SUs, but were they the same for students within that particular supervisory union. And so oftentimes what we do when we look at equity gaps is we compare groups. And what's really important here is that when we compare groups, what we are frequently trying to figure out is someone getting more privilege than another group? Is there a privilege being conferred to a group of students at the expense of another or instead of another? And what's really a struggle here, and I think you've alluded to this already, is that sometimes a particular group may need more than another group in order for the experience to be equitable. And so I'm not in a position to say to you that I believe the desired outcome is necessarily an equal sign between these groups, and I'm going to ask you for some opinions on that. But in Vermont, in particular, the groups that we are most frequently comparing are white Caucasian students compared to our non-white students, and we can break that down into different ethnicities and races depending on the size of that particular school and that particular group. In some cases, it's better for us to look at all groups together because without it, there's not enough students for the data to be reported. In other cases, we have enough students for us to look at it. So this is one comparison we might make. Another comparison we might make is students who are not on free and reduced lunch compared to those who are, students who are English
So
speakers.
let's just make sure we understand. So you made the point about white Caucasian and non-whites. So we should come up with a like or dislike from those comments.
If you have something you like or dislike, feel free to write it down.
About comparing.
Sure. About anything that I'm saying in these two slides.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. We might compare our students who do not have an IEP or a 504 to students who do have those documents that speak to a disability that they may have, and males compared to females. Now, what's difficult with this is deciding which is Group A and which is Group B and how you compare. Does it matter? And for me, it doesn't matter. I only give them a title Group A and Group B because there are two groups we're comparing and contrasting to one. Neither is preferred, neither is considered the goal group to have the statistics of that group, but they are two groups that we frequently compare. So one thing we might do, no decisions yet, but if the indicator were the percent of students demonstrating proficiency in mathematics through Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3, those are the same standards in the Common Core. So if we were looking at the percentage of the student body who had demonstrated this mastery, and we were comparing, and this particular fake supervisory union that I'm looking at here, and all of this is fake, none of this is real, it's all made up, it has no basis in reality. If we were looking at them and their data showed that 72% of their white Caucasian students were proficient in Algebra 2, Integrated Math 3, but 66% of the non-white students were, we would identify that as a gap of 6%. So there would be a gap between those groups. And looking down through the list, because I started this with a premise, which is not to say where we're going, it was just for a conversation starter. If the premise is that the gap is what matters, absolute value of that gap, using a math term to freak anyone out who doesn't love math, absolute value of that gap is what I decided we were going to focus on. This would imply, if we used absolute value, that equal was actually a desired outcome, because having a negative would not matter. So in this case, if we look at it and you add up all of those numbers together, they have 55 gap points divided by 5 possible areas. That would mean their total gap at this school is 11. If I'm in charge of the supervisory union, I'm looking at the data, and what I am identifying is the places where I'm not serving students well is particularly my students on free and reduced lunch, my English learners, and my students with IEPs or 504s, and that would be where I'd target my work. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is think about your likes and dislikes from this notion of an equity gap index, a way of measuring within a school how similar the educational opportunity is for kids of different groups, different characteristics. I'll give you about a minute to do that. Again, hasn't been vetted by anyone, and it's still in the planning stages. We have the next summit is coming up. But towards this idea of how would our data help us to understand if things were substantially equal. So I'm going to walk through this idea. If we were looking at an SU and it had sort of average academic achievement, but its average academic achievement was kind of right on par with other supervisory unions, that squiggly equal sign means substantially equal. So it's substantially equal to other supervisory unions, other school supervisory districts. But when we look at that equity index within the school, there is large internal gaps. So in this case, this school has average achievement. It's a lot like the other SUs, but it has some inequity within its own system, and that's shown by a larger bracket. When we look at the personalized learning for this SU, it has an overall strong assessment. It's doing better than other SUs on this particular metric. It looks pretty good. And when we look at the personalization, there's not very much evidence that that there's huge inequalities, but it's not equivalent for all student subgroups. They have some gaps.
Okay, so you explained that, but so how, you want us to do something in the boxes in the middle?
I think we don't have time today.
Okay.
Yeah. The last one that I'm going to talk about is the safe school climate. In this case, they have a really low rating. They're not doing well on it. They're substantially worse than other SUs, but they have a very small internal equity gap, and that basically means that everyone at the school is experiencing this badly. Okay, but they're not having inequities. So one of the questions that I have for you is, what about this, and maybe you can just verbally tell me, what about this kind of display, the explanation wouldn't show, what about this helps you to see, or doesn't help you to see, this notion of substantially equal across SUs and substantially equal within the SU? So what do you like, not like, what's helping, what's not helping?
I have a resistance to a systematic approach to teaching. That good principal, good teachers should be working together, and best teaching results will be a result of it. I'm not sure a systematic approach will get you what I mean, I'm married to a teacher that went through many different system changes, and I'm not sure what the goal was achieved in any of them, but.
Can you say that again? I'm not sure I completely understand.
Well, this is a common, you're in the education business. This systematic approach to, in terms of best teaching this has been around a long time. Think of what all the different programs that we have had in the state and from the feds have applied and whatnot. Anyway.
If nothing else, what we've learned from this little exercise is how difficult your job is.
Thanks! And why we need another deputy.
Yes, yes.
I was actually, Peter, I totally agree with your premise, but I don't see that coming out of this. I see something very different. I think what I like about this is that it provides a variety of ways of looking at similar data. I especially like that little narrow green thingy saying that just because there's not an equity gap doesn't mean it's a good thing. And I think I like this idea that there'd be multiple ways of looking at data, because I could easily see a school saying, well, we're no different than all of our other SUs, therefore we're fine, or we don't have an equity gap, therefore we're fine. But if the equity gap is everyone's experiencing this poorly, that's obviously not our goal. And I think that it's a way to maybe get away from, are you a good teacher or a bad teacher, but kind of more, I see just some more systems. And I don't know, I find it kind of intriguing, so I like what I see there.
Yeah, I love this. With the graphics, the color, and the explanation.
That's true, it matters.
I'm all about the data, and when I can look at something and clearly understand what it's showing, I think this is fabulous, and I think when it's on a larger scale is going to be life-saving.
So you only thought you
Kudos.
were going to Italy next year.
Oh, right? I guess this is what I'm doing instead.
Krista?
I do like how you can see the strengths and then the challenges for each school. So we all like to say our schools are great, and they all are great, but what are those areas of challenges? And I think that really highlights that and allows you to sort of get a visual. I agree, like having some sort of visual that you can look at, and it's data I think the public could really get behind and use. So it's not in such educational language, like it's simple but at the same time, it's taking the data from the EQRs and putting it into a visual form. I like it.
Yes, Tom.
So we're teaching in an equitable way, but we need to present data in an equitable way too to our community. And it makes more sense to me to read this than to read numbers. And I think it's just easier for everyone to understand.
Right, and I think ultimately in the end, it's going to be up to board members to help drive the strategic plan and the mission and budgets.
The local board.
The local boards, and I think this is at a good level for that as well.
And I did not say this, Bill, I'll get your comment in a minute, but of course what we would envision is that if you clicked on the academic achievement, this is the starting page. If you clicked on the academic achievement, it would then open to a window that gave you all of the individual measures that created that, so that you could see, do you have this level of inequity in every measure, or is it just certain measures? Are some measures you're having greater success with than others? And so one of the worries we do also have is that people will drown in the data. So we're trying to be strategic about that. Bill, you had one last comment?
I think defining the criteria is the absolutely essential thing, and I don't know where you got those. Those are not bad, but they can't be added. You lose data if you start adding them across the thing, and it gets me into thinking about what is it inside of each of these, and how are the composites made?
Yes. So the five
huge.
criteria come directly out of EQS. We can find specific references in EQS that drive this. So these are the five that's where that comes from. But underneath each one of them, there will be criteria, and that's part of what you at the summit will contribute to identifying what some of those identifiers will be and which one they will go in, and whether or not some indicators might actually be on two separate buckets or not. So for example, if we're looking at the percentage of students who participate in one or more of many non-traditional learning opportunities, that might fall under academic achievement, it might fall under personalization. It's hard to say, right? So we're still deciding all of those things. That's part of what the summit is contributing to.
We need to move on.
Thank you so much for your time.
Should we schedule you for in June as well?
Yes, I think Rebecca is actually thinking that this may be one of the things we could spend some time at the retreat on in
Okay.
a deep way. I'm happy to come anytime you would like to have me.
Let's do that then.
I'm going to grab your papers from you
Yes.
because input is always
All right,
helpful.
it
And
is,
you can email me anytime.
It's noon. Lunch is scheduled for noon, but we, yeah. Ben, do you want to give your presentation now, or would you like to wait till after lunch?
Whatever you folks are feeling. It'll take me about 11 minutes.
Wow, that's precision.
And whoever's in charge of lunch, could they alert them that we're going to be 12 minutes late? Oh, it's here, okay.
We'll take a snack now.
No, let's get the presentation.
Three handouts here. You can just take one of each. Are coming around are a brochure from the National Education Arts Partnership Program on the benefits of arts education, as well as a letter of support from the Vermont Art Teachers Association, which is the largest professional association of art teachers in Vermont and a national affiliate, and then a report of findings from a summit that we hosted in September that I'm going to speak about, as well as a community listening tour that we took place this past winter in St. Johnsbury, Randolph, Bennington, Brattleboro, and Burlington. So I'd like to begin. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Doyle, and I'm the Education Manager for the Vermont Arts Council, the state's arts agency. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. Today I'd like to tell you about the ways in which the Arts Council is working to increase access to excellent arts education opportunities in Vermont, what we see as the challenges facing arts education in the state, and what we believe the State Board of Education can do to help address these challenges. Given that I'm the last person on the agenda before lunch, I promise to be succinct. The Vermont Arts Council's mission is to advance and preserve the arts at the center of Vermont communities. Supporting arts education is a central part of our work, and the Council has a long history of working to ensure that Vermont students have the opportunity to learn in, about, and through the arts. Over the past 50 years, tens of thousands of Vermont students have experienced the magic of the arts by working with one of the Council's jury teaching artists through the Artists in Schools residency program. In addition to this grant program, we have a number of other educational initiatives. Our Head Start Arts Partnership, for example, is a collaboration between local arts organizations and Head Start classrooms to provide professional development in arts integration for early childhood learning teachers. We also coordinate the Poetry Out Loud program in Vermont. This program encourages high school students to memorize and recite the work of noted poets in a pyramid-style competition that begins at the classroom level and culminates in a national championship in Washington, D.C. This year, 5,189 Vermont students from 43 different high schools participated in the program, and the state finals were broadcast on Vermont PBS. As a former high school English teacher myself, I can attest to the transformative power of Poetry Out Loud. Not only do students have the chance to connect with their literary heritage, develop a love of language and poetry, but they also gain the confidence and public speaking skills that will serve them well throughout their lives. I mention these programs so that you have a sense of the work that the Council does and to provide some context for our recent advocacy efforts to advance student access to arts education. During the past 15 years, changes in the educational landscape have adversely affected the role of arts in Vermont schools. An emphasis on standardized testing has in many cases marginalized the arts, and they have fallen victim to the false belief that if something can easily be measured through a standardized test, it must not be that important. In 2011, the Vermont Alliance for Arts Education, which had advocated for the arts in Vermont schools and provided needed professional development, folded. In 2010, the Vermont Agency of Education eliminated its arts content specialist position, which now limits the support the agency is able to provide arts instructors in the field. Perhaps most daunting are the funding challenges Vermont schools face, which directly affect the quality and quantity of arts instruction in our schools. Faced with difficult staffing decisions, local school boards and school administrators too often see the arts as nice, but not necessary. Still, Vermont and this board recognizes the importance of arts education. The recently adopted education quality standards state that, quote, each school shall enable students to engage annually in rigorous, relevant, and comprehensive learning opportunities that allow them to demonstrate proficiency in artistic expression, including visual, media, and performing arts. We have yet to meet this ideal. According to educational census data, 91% of Vermont public schools offer both music and art, which sounds pretty good. When those numbers are cross-referenced with data on full-time equivalent status, however, we see a wide variation in the depth of instruction. For example, 18% of the schools that report having a visual arts program employ a quarter-time or less visual arts teacher. 14% employ an art teacher at between quarter-time and half-time full-time equivalent status. 23% at half-time to full-time. That means that only 45% of Vermont schools actually employ a full-time art teacher, a number complicated by the fact that a single full-time art teacher often works with 400 or more students a week. Similarly, only 50% of schools report having a full-time music teacher. Less than 1% of public schools in Vermont report having a full-time theater or dance teacher. In response to these challenges and the perception that there is a lack of leadership around the issue of arts education in Vermont, the Board of the Vermont Arts Council in its most recent strategic plan identified supporting arts education as a priority. This past September, the Council, with support from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, the Office of the Creative Economy, and the Vermont Agency of Education, held a visioning session on the future of arts education in Vermont. The participants, 120 leaders in the arts, education, nonprofit organizations, government, and business communities, identified a series of priorities and strategies to increase student access to arts education. Their findings served as the basis for a statewide series of community forums held this past winter about the issue. The thoughts and recommendations of the stakeholders involved in this process can be found in the report I've shared with you. While there are literally dozens of things that could be done right now to improve arts education in Vermont, there are 5 recommendations that, if acted upon, the Council believes will have an immediate and meaningful impact. They are, 1, that the Agency of Education should employ an arts content specialist. 2, Vermont should adopt the new National Core Art Standards. 3, there should be high quality professional development for arts educators and non-arts educators focused on ways to integrate the arts across the curriculum. 4, advocates for arts education should build an advocacy toolkit with current research on the importance of arts education. 5, partnerships between schools and arts organizations should be fostered to create more opportunity for the arts, in the arts for students. You can find out more about these recommendations in the report, but right now I'd like to focus briefly on the first two, that the agency employ an arts content specialist and that the state adopt the new National Core Art Standards. The National Core Art Standards were developed over 3 years by a national network of thousands of educators. They are supported by online assessment models and national forums. Our current standards for the arts, the Vermont Framework, are now over a decade old, and unlike the National Core Art Standards, do not include media art standards, despite the fact that emergent media is one of the most exciting and promising growth areas in the creative economy. Our career and technical education centers are leaders in emergent media, as anyone who has visited Essex Tech Center, for example, knows. But the lack of current, rigorous, and relevant K-10 media or visual arts standards limits the pathways students can take to be fully prepared for the opportunities these centers offer. While there is significant consensus in the field that Vermont should adopt the new standards, statewide implementation would be difficult without a point person at the agency to guide that process. If you can, imagine for a moment what it is like to be one of the many, many itinerant art teachers in Vermont. Given your part-time status, you are already limited in your ability to truly become part of a school community, to collaborate with your peers on interdisciplinary instruction, or to participate in professional development opportunities. Now imagine you have questions about the new proficiency-based graduation standards, or the new National Core Art Standards, or indeed the standards in the Vermont Framework and how they relate to the Common Core. There is literally no one for you to call. Vermont is one of only 8 states in the country that does not have an arts content specialist at its agency of education. And because no one at the agency is specifically charged with supporting arts educators, the arts are the only content subject mentioned in the EQS that do not have an associated specialist. While that's a logistical challenge at a minimum, it's also a challenge to morale in the field. The Council has been extremely encouraged by recent collaborations with the Agency of Education. During the past 2 years, Council staff had the opportunity to provide input on the EQS, to serve on working groups for teacher certification requirements and proficiency-based graduation standards. We've been active on the Implementing Standards and Assessment Advisory Council, and collaborated with the agency on an episode of Join the Conversation about arts education and out-of-school learning. But the Council and other arts organizations in the state will be most successful in serving Vermont students when we have the opportunity to collaborate with a designated arts content specialist at the agency to leverage community partnerships, expertise, as well as national resources. As noted in the introduction of the report I have provided, the arts are everywhere in Vermont. They inform our identity as a state and the character of our communities, and they are a powerful economic driver. Vermont's creative sector generates over $550 million in total sales annually, creates more than 7,400 jobs, and produces nearly $160 million in compensation. There is abundant research-based evidence on the impact of arts education and student achievement. The brochure from the Arts Education Partnership that I have provided you with is just a sampling. Ask students, and many will tell you that the arts keep them coming to school, keeps them engaged, helps them realize their potential as citizens and human beings. The Council sincerely hopes that the State Board of Education will work with us to ensure that the next generation of Vermonters has the opportunity to develop their creative and artistic abilities. Vermont needs them to do so. You can help by adopting the national standards and by encouraging the Agency of Education to employ an arts content specialist. Thank you.
That was a great presentation. Thank you. And we will certainly take your 5, and particularly the 2 recommendations that you recommend under advisement. I'm sorry we're kind of cramped for time.
Fine. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
I spent last evening at Marlborough College with, I don't know if you know this name, Ellen Lovell.
She was the keynote speaker at our summit.
She was retiring from Marlborough College, and I met her at the Vermont Arts Council when I served in the legislature years ago.
Yeah, she's an exceptional leader.
She is. And we appreciate your presentation, and we'll get back to you on this.
Great. Thank you so much.
Can I just add one thing, Stephen?
Sure.
I just want to say, we are indebted to you and to the groups that you work with, because you have tried to step in and fill a void that we're well aware of in the state, and I just want to personally express my gratitude for your strong advocacy.
And I just want to say, if I can return the compliment, that I've been in this job 2.5 years, and I work a lot with local arts agencies that have educational leaders in them, and everyone is very heartened by. They know that you care about the arts and that the agency is trying to address this issue. So,
and I think this is an issue of will. we can do this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to recess.
Oh, look at us. Right. Going outside with my apple juice. This mural that you'll know here was done by Adelaide Tyrell many years ago. Amazing muralist. She has been a mentor for many Renaissance studies for students interested in art. Very talented. And this is just like the hallway of inspiration. I don't know why all schools don't have amazing art like this on the walls. Because it's so much better than just looking at the plain tan that's just through the rest of it, you know? Yeah, so we're going outside first, because it's so nice out.
Huge conference center off the highway across from the biggest shopping mall I've seen in like decades. Just looks like it's not a place.
This is our bread oven that we made in, I think, 2005. All the Twinfield students got to take a turn coming out and mushing some straw into clay with our feet to make what you don't even see here. But it's really cool, a nice dome-shaped bread oven, and we make mostly pizzas in it, especially when we have big gatherings like a conference we just held here last week.
Or Miss Whalen, a former teacher here, she used to do humanities, and they did a project on wheat and how to harvest wheat and how to grow it. So they did that here, and then they actually made bread out of the wheat that they harvested with the brick oven. So it was awesome. They got to go through the whole process.
So this is just the first of many really cool things Twinfield. This year we're learning to make ski bikes. So they're attaching skis to bikes to ride them down hills and stuff. But they also will make motorbikes and attach chainsaws to bicycles.
They did that last year during J-term, which is when we have 4 extra days of school and you sign up for like an activity to do. So there's one called Crazy Engineer, and a kid named Joe Pallas 2 years ago made a motorized bike with a chainsaw motor with Trevor Tate in his classroom. And they got it going, which was awesome. He was just zooming around with his helmet in the parking lot. It was cool.
Doing anything, then your time is yours, and as long as you use it responsibly and constructively, then go ahead.
But you can't just like wander into the woods. It's not like that lax.
Is that for high school or for all?
Mostly for high school. In middle school, you definitely have like a stricter. And we end up with like long boards of cedar, and we glue them together, and then we start carving our canoe paddles out of them when we're in 8th grade. And they just left with the canoes, like you guys were saying. But students have the opportunity to work about, I don't know, an hour a week on the canoe, or you can stay after school. And I did that when I was in 8th grade, so I put in 20 plus hours into sanding and fiberglassing and ruining all my clothes for that canoe. So it's really fun if you're really into like hands-on activities.
The last one, what do you end up putting on?
Some start, very good. They start
This is
even just square.
Trevor Tate was the left. They go
the
practice
shape
on the marshmallow.
and whatever design go out.
Yeah. So the kit comes with strips of wood, and you just piece them in. Then you got this is our student art gallery for high school, so independent art or any of the high school classes like painting, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, the art's so great.
And it's just nice. It gives a sense that like, oh my gosh, okay, so we're in a place of learning and creativity and students. And I think better than like walking in and seeing like metal detectors as you enter a building, to see student artwork is
You like that better?
110 times better.
And you want to tell them about our teacher Jan, who's retiring this year?
Yes, Jan Danzinger has been here for
40 years.
43 years. Wow. She taught my dad art when he went here in
And
the
our
80s.
old principal, Owen Bradley,
Three of each grade, so we have 3, 5, 6 classrooms. So this is one, and we switch it up. We do a 5th grade math and a 6th grade math. So this is one of our 5th grade maths, reinforcing multiplication. But we also do another 5th grade math and a whole 6th grade. We have about 60 students in a 5-6. So we're getting through the year. We're getting through it.
Math and like all those sorts of kind things that, you know, just, and you get to read it and understand that we're all here to support one another and that we're all a part of this tree. As much as emphasis as there is on the individual and how important that is, though, we are still one and so connected. And so this kindness tree helps me remember that.
And the teachers' pictures, and they just put it around the circle of friends. So you see the whole elementary faces up on one little section of the wall.
Colors.
Oh,
Red and white.
and black.
Just to show that, again, we're all here together in this, and we may all have our own pieces, but we're all contributing.
Go back to agenda item I, pre-K rulemaking. Well, it's Rebecca's on the agenda, but she's saying that she's delegated.
I'm delegating to my better partner.
Karen Edwards, Agency of Education, and we have our hearing, we have 7 sites open, we have staff at every site, we have our procedures.
We're having trouble hearing you.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
We have our, we have a site up for public comment. We have the hearings coming right up. We have, I believe, 7 sites open all over the state. We have staff at every site, and we have set procedures for how those will run. So hopefully we'll be back to you before too long.
Any questions?
Just going to say, we sent out a second set of guidance. We have 2 more webinars coming up, and we have a frequently asked questions that should go out the end of this week.
It shows you that we're getting work.
Karen, have you been getting a lot, any or a lot of feedback on the website that you have up or open?
I want to see how it plays on.
We've gotten some very positive comments about the webinars. Oh, you're talking about the comment website?
Right.
Not yet.
Any other questions or comments? If not, well, thank you, and probably see you next month for an update.
Okay. You'll be seeing me again in a few minutes, actually.
Oh, okay.
Can I give it, I'm sorry to take advantage of you again, Stephen. I just wanted to give a shout out to Karen and her team who have worked not just on implementing Act 166, but have been working full-time on overdrive around the pre-K expansion grants. So just thanking you for all your work. It's a phenomenal effort by this group.
Let me ask the board, do you want to proceed now and talk about the retreat, or I noticed that Greg is here, do you want to move on to the agenda and maybe save it for near the end? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, thank you.
Greg, thank you for arriving early, and we'd like to take up agenda item L, clarifications regarding independent schools approvals. And I believe we've got something in the packet on this.
Yes, good afternoon.
For the record, would you say your name, please?
Yes, my name is Greg Glennon. I'm the General Counsel at the Agency of Education.
I took mine out.
And I'm here today to present on discussion item L, clarification regarding independent school approvals. And the purpose of this recommended item is to clarify how the agency is interpreting Rule 2225.9 of the State Board's rules, and this is around evidence of financial capacity for independent school applicants for initial approval and renewal. And there's some, the language of the rule itself, which I pointed out, provides that the agency can evaluate evidence of financial capacity if an applicant for independent school approval submits certain information. And what we understand, believe the rule to mean, is that if a school is not approved by an entity like NEASC, which is a fairly well-known accrediting entity that's had a long-standing relationship with our agency and has a very well-staffed, their review process is robust, and an entity like NEASC is perceived as a very reliable organization to come in from the outside and accredit, or for a school to go through an accreditation process with. So setting aside for the moment schools that don't have approval from an entity like NEASC, we at the agency need to evaluate evidence of financial capacity among several other factors prior to coming before the board with a recommended action on an application for independent school approval. So for those schools that are not approved by NEASC or in the midst of a NEASC approval process, our rules, your rules say evidence of financial capacity may be shown by one of the following. And in certain cases, if one of these four items is submitted and one of our education finance managers who assists with our reviews of independent school applications doesn't feel like we have enough evidence to weigh to make a reliable recommendation to the board about the financial capacity of one of these schools, our view is that the only logical way to interpret the rule is to simply go back at the applicant within the parameters of the rule to say, well, you've submitted, for example, a notarized letter summarizing the financial status of the fiscal health of the school, but there's been no supporting documentation provided along with that letter. So we might, for example, respond to the applicant, we might like to ask you to also submit additional evidence such as an audit from the present or prior fiscal year. And typically with most applications we get something along the lines of an audit that is a pretty satisfactory window into the financial health of the school. But on occasion, if we don't, we just want to be sure that we're proceeding correctly, that this is a tool in our toolbox and we want to use it if we need to. And ultimately, the point here is to be able to come before this board and make a reliable recommendation that an entity that we're approving to possibly be eligible to receive public tuition funds, for example, is going to
a couple of questions.
be viable financially.
I agree with you that the second one, the notarized letter, seems pretty weak.
Right.
I mean, anybody in their own best interest could certify that and get it notarized, and
That's right.
wouldn't give it a lot of credibility. The fourth one, a statement of financial capacity of a private, state, or regional agency recognized by the state board. Who might that? I don't even understand that.
Right. That would be NEASC, which is what I was going to
Okay,
be getting
okay.
back to. So that what I've done here is I've just drafted a brief narrative breaking out schools approved by an entity like NEASC and schools that are not approved by an entity like NEASC. And in our world, it's mostly NEASC-approved schools that we come before this board and say, well, this school has gone through a rigorous and robust NEASC review process, and we at the agency, frankly, can't really match that or exceed that, and we're content to rely upon those detailed factual findings and recommendations that NEASC is making to us about the viability of this school and its curriculum offerings and its physical site and so on, which sort of tracks the state board's role. So for efficiency's sake and because the quality's good, it makes a lot of sense, we think, to essentially have state board, to recommend that the state board consider approving schools that have NEASC approval and track the approval term concurrently with the NEASC approval up to the maximum period of time that this board can extend approval, which presently is a 5-year approval term.
The agency is recommending, just to be clear, is recommending only schools that were priorly approved by NEASC, and not any of the other 3 conditions that are listed under the rule.
Right, if a school has
I
NEASC.
understand.
It's expedited review, really, for NEASC.
Right.
NEASC has been a good partner. They work with us. There are certain state statutory requirements, for example, around hazing, harassment, and bullying, which they have built into their review of Vermont schools. And so,
Not questioning that. What I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand is what the agency is proposing, that do we amend, are you suggesting we amend the rule and drop out these other 3 proposals?
no.
No, this
We're
is
saying for
interpretation.
NEASC, for the interpretation, the NEASC, if they've had a NEASC approval, that we approve them concurrent with an approved NEASC term. But that for cases where they don't have any approval or recognition by an external body, as outlined in 4, that we be allowed to go back and get additional documentation if necessary to verify the financial security of the institution. Is that?
That's basically it.
Yeah, it just makes sense to me that if you haven't gone through number 4, and if you get a notarized letter, it's not enough. I mean, I would think that going back and looking for more information just helps us make our decision, and it is invaluable. So, I mean, I think when it asks, does the board support and endorse this, I mean, I would say yes. This seems like a reasonable interpretation, especially when it says in the rule that may be shown by one of the following,
Right.
not that must be shown by one.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Other
And a
questions? Sean Marie?
Well, a rule change would take quite a bit longer than a procedural implementation. And I guess I totally agree. I support this 100%. One of the things I will say from going through a couple of NEASC evaluations is that I would perhaps coincide with 6 months past their date, because there's often recommendations that are made that then could be brought into so that the state sees what the recommendations are and how they plan to implement, and the dates are not always so succinct.
Okay.
I mean, that's
That's good
just
to
a
know.
suggestion.
Thank you.
Good suggestion.
So do we need a motion on this?
Can I just, the primary
Peter.
reason we're doing this is because there's public money. If this was just a private independent school without any public money, this wouldn't be our purview to be doing this. Is that correct?
It would be. I mean, it's our rules. But I think the level of, I mean,
I think
And
for,
look at
for
their books?
an approved independent school, not a recognized independent school.
Yeah.
Correct?
Right.
so an approved independent school can have,
Right, I know the
Access
difference,
to
yeah.
money, yeah.
And there are independent schools that are approved that aren't eligible for different reasons to receive public funds, but nonetheless, under state law and the board's rules, those schools have every right to request approved status, and we would certainly want to make sure that any entity that's blessed by the board as an approved independent school has, gone through some level of rigorous review, whether it's by an entity like NEASC or an agency-based review.
so this is outside the question of wanting all independent schools to have the same bar as public schools. That's outside this conversation.
Yes, that's not relevant today. So, I'm not clear, the agenda says that we should be voting on something.
Can I make a motion?
Yes.
That the board supports and endorses the agency's interpretation of Rule 225.9 as set forth on the document provided.
Is there a second to that motion? Further discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and we've approved. One quick question before you leave. I have a vague memory of a independent international school that was before this board at one point, and I think we tabled it. Do you know the status of that?
Can I follow up with you after the meeting and see where that's at?
Okay.
Okay.
It's not urgent. It's just the fact that we were bringing this up today.
Okay, thank you.
And my only concern is that I hate to have things tabled for a long time.
I understand.
Okay.
Okay.
All right? Thank you. Move on to item M, adoption of national standards for health education and physical education. Would you ladies please introduce yourselves for the record?
My name is Lindsay Simpson. I'm the physical education coordinator for the Agency of Education.
Donna McAllister, health education consultant for the Agency of Education.
I'll just
Well-
take a minute and set up.
Okay.
Sure. So, first of all, thank you for having us here. This has been a long time coming for us, and we're really pleased to be here and have this conversation. Thank you. Okay. So what we'd like to ask you to do today is consider adopting the national standards for physical education and a separate document, a national standards document for health education, to replace the current grade expectations documents that we have and are approved by the state board right now. That's our ask. Okay. So actually, thanks for the next one, Jill. So we sent you in advance a one-pager with some of the key points that we'd just like to review with you now. So next one. Most importantly, I think we want to address that our recommendation we see as being helpful to implement the current education quality standards, specifically under these sections. So, of course, you know under curriculum content that really what we're trying to do is shift to a proficiency-based system. And we feel like this is a wise move to help do that for a number of reasons that we'll get into as we talk through these sections. So under curriculum content, curriculum coordination, graduation requirements, and also the local comprehensive assessment system. Again, as you know, we do not have a statewide assessment for either health education or for physical education. And so that's why, again, we feel it's really important to have the most current national standards documents from which to derive local assessments in those two content areas.
And if I may add that this strategy of adopting both national health education standards and the physical education standards will give teachers access to many, many more resources because of the national stature. So no longer depending upon local resources, but they will have more national resources to access to help them move forward.
So I can add to that by saying, for example, in physical education, the national body, which is called Shape America, is working now on even a second next best set of motor assessments that can be implemented at the local level. So it really allows, we hope that this kind of a strategy would allow teachers to really focus on the individualization of learning and accommodations that need to happen at the local level. As we've done with the other content areas for language arts, mathematics, and science, we see this sort of being aligned with that same strategy, again, of national sets of standards, large bodies of states who are binding together to work on the same sets of standards. To establish those learning goals for Vermont students that are, again, aligned with peers in education across the country. So Donna referred to that piece about national access there. In addition to that, for example, another set of resources that are aligned with these national standards come from our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There are two sets of curriculum assessment tools that are specifically designed for physical education and for health education. And so we find those to be in alignment with the national standards as well, and another useful tool that schools can use as they work towards a proficiency-based system. Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. Okay. So what we did was I pooled health educators in the state, and we are small in number but big in stature. And out of the 26 respondents, 77% said they already use the national health education standards in their curriculum development work. And overwhelmingly, they all agreed to encourage us to pursue the adoption of these national health education standards.
How many gym teachers are there in the state? Just curious if this was a survey of 26.
This was just health teachers.
Just health teachers?
Just health. There are two separate endorsement areas, one for PE and one for health. So Lindsay will talk about the PE teachers in a minute.
So how many health teachers are there then? Just same question, just seeing how the 26.
I would say employed in schools, probably no more than 100.
So why is this, I think I had the same question, why is this response so low? I mean, it's a very good percentage, but the number that actually responded, was the time period too short?
The time, well, we do not necessarily collect information as to who's teaching in what schools. So this was actually a pool of health educators that I had their email and contact information for, and I did send it out to them. I do work with a community of health educators of which there are 40, which is it's a pretty good number. And I did send it out to them and sent it out to some other people also who I know were employed teaching health. And this was the response that we got back from those 40 or 50 that I sent it out to.
Electronic survey,
Yes, yes.
response rates sometimes get pretty low on electronic surveys.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to know when it might be appropriate to ask a question in terms of either the health or the PE at grade level and where something might be.
the content specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, anytime.
So in the health arena, I work with young teen parents, and I know, being on a school board for 20 years, the topic of sex education, and specifically the word sex education, comes up and is extremely controversial right out of the gate. So in looking at the standards in like grade 4 and 5, I see social responsibility, I see respect, I see etiquette, but I'm wondering where specifically the sort of maybe prevention or information, I'm really hoping it's before 6th grade somewhere.
State statute indicates that schools shall provide comprehensive health education K-6, and it should be developmentally appropriate. The grade expectations that were developed in 2007, which are the documents that we are recommending be replaced with the National Health Education Standards, do indicate in grade 3, that is where sexuality, I'm going to say officially, is really touched upon. But developmentally appropriate, you lay the groundwork and you lay the foundation in kindergarten and 1st grade when you're talking about consent, and when you're talking about interpersonal communication skills, and when you're talking about
And that
talking to an
respect
adult.
strand, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure it was, it's sometimes when it's not specific, it sort of
Right.
goes like so.
Right. And we also do have Act 1, which was the Brooke-Bennett legislation that was passed 3 or 4 years ago, that now requires schools to also include sexual violence prevention education as part of comprehensive health education. K-12.
So that's part of the health curriculum that schools are supposed to implement?
Correct.
And then health teachers typically are only 6 through 12 or 7 through 12, right?
In grades 7 through 12, if you're providing health education, you should have an endorsement to teach health education. In grades K through 6, a classroom teacher's endorsement allows them to teach health within units within their classroom. So they can teach health education within their classroom. If they are traveling from classroom to classroom providing health education, they should have a health education endorsement, of which we do have a small number of teachers teaching at the elementary level that do have a health education endorsement.
Peter?
And what role does the nurses have in this arena?
There are many nurses who are licensed as a school nurse in addition to having a health education endorsement. So if they're in the classroom providing health education, they should have an endorsement to teach health education.
Otherwise, no certification.
They should have the certification. Now, that doesn't mean that the classroom teacher or someone can't invite the nurse in to do a couple of lessons within their units, because they might have more expertise, just like you would invite a guest speaker into a social studies class or into a math class.
Wasn't there a point in time when all nurses had to be certified?
Nurses have to have and this is not the area of my expertise, but they have to have a school nursing endorsement to be a nurse in a school.
RNs and LNAs can work under the supervision of the
Of an
RN.
RN.
Yeah.
That's why you should be on that board.
I was on a board when this all came up, believe me, I have fond memories of it.
Do you have more you want to add on the physical education?
Sure, just quickly. I can
No,
do
I'm
that.
sorry.
So I surveyed the Vermont physical education teachers, of which, to answer your question, there's probably about 400 or so employed in schools right now. And so that survey went to 163 teachers. You can see the stats there, but I just also want to emphasize that the teachers also indicate they are using the GEs as well. So it's not that they're saying they use the national standards in place of the GEs, they use both. And I highlighted the interest in using national standards here. So the other thing I want to add that I think is really important about this new national standard set for phys ed is that it's really centered around this beautiful concept of physical literacy. And the idea here is that the standards are based on the research that tells us that youth and young adults, as we leave school, will be most likely to engage in physical activity for a lifetime if they develop competence in the skills and aptitudes that are listed in the standards. So we tend to think about it that if they like it, they will keep doing it, but what the research tells us is that if they are competent, they will continue to be engaged in physical activity for a lifetime and have better health outcomes and better contributions to their community as working, vibrant people. So this idea of physical literacy is something that I've been exploring over the last 6 or 8 weeks with a group of PE teacher leaders in the state, and we've just had a really wonderful time really digging deeply into this term, and it's been a really good experience, and they're just so wholeheartedly behind doing this. They think it's really the right way to go in the next, future years. So it really wouldn't be much of a shift there either. Okay. Certainly, yeah, they add the Great Expectations as a supplementary document, but they know they're preparing students who may not teach outside of Vermont, so that's why they rely on national standards. Yes.
And we do have one program for health education, and because they prepare teachers for outside of Vermont, they do spend much more time on national standards, so they're better equipped if they go back to their states. Yeah.
Now, this is presented to the board as one motion, but I thought I heard one of you say that it needs to be 2 motions?
Our request is that you consider adopting 2 separate documents. We just really wanted to be clear that it's not one document that addresses health ed and phys ed. They are separate documents.
All right, we might do that in 2 motions, just to be clear. And I guess not that I necessarily would have read it all, but, I did note in the green sheet that you allowed us a place where we could go online and actually copy the rules and regulations. But I think in the future, if the agency, I'm trying not to look at anybody when I say this, that when the agency wants us to take up and adopt a rule, we probably ought to have the benefit of having a copy in advance. So.
Of the actual standards.
The actual standards.
So paper copy,
paper.
not a link.
Yeah, well, you're one of the few places that are still sending us paper, so as long as you're sending us paper, and I'm not suggesting you stop sending us paper.
We'll put that in the minutes.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's fine. Do you need your link?
No, I just wanted to comment for all of us that the standard level 1 and level 2 in high school addresses working with others and stress management as one of the standards, which in this world that we're going into, or that they're going into, I think is very appropriate.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. That's one of the features of these new phys ed standards that I really appreciate. It also integrates nutrition for the first time ever, whereas that was really indicated separately in the health ed standard. So we're seeing a little more of that overlap.
It's a really nice rubric, or the way it's laid out there.
They've done a really nice job, the national body. Yeah.
Morgan?
Well, I haven't had the privilege of looking at this yet, so I was hoping you could just explicitly lay out what these new standards give us that we don't currently have right now.
Right. So for physical education, again, these are driving the instruction and assessment around that concept of physical literacy, so that what we do is the document has grade level outcomes listed for every single grade that really help us, our teachers, to structure the key important learning pieces that our students will be able to demonstrate for proficiency. And there's really nice alignment, I think, between our sample proficiency documents and our sample transferable skills documents as well. So I think it really takes a leap. This document is 10 years newer than what we have currently, and I really think it propels us forward into doing some of those things like you also pointed out, Jean-Marie, around stress management, self-efficacy. That's the real shift that I see that's really important here. Thanks for asking.
Yes.
So I hope in no way is this misconstrued as any lack of enthusiasm for physical education. I love this document, and I wish my daughter had PE all day long, 5 days a week. It's so specific, and there's so many things. I'm just wondering, my daughter has PE twice a week for 35 minutes, let's say. So like to get down to like a specific, this one jumped out at me just because it was so, I'm not even sure what it means. Demonstrates 4 of the 5 critical elements for jumping and landing in a horizontal plane using a variety of 1 and 2 foot takeoffs and landings. And I was wondering, okay, I'm sure that's more simple than I'm imagining, but do you think it's feasible, given we've been talking about capacity, are PE teachers going to be able to do these things, and how does it work to actually assess in a way that's like authentic, not just a whole days of like, no, you jump and you jump and you jump and I'm gonna check. I don't know. How do you imagine that working, I guess is what I'm asking.
Again, back to the proficiency-based system and the local control around developing those graduation proficiencies and outcomes. I see this being really critical to inform that, but that it wouldn't be in such specific detail. There wouldn't necessarily be assessment of and grading on every single skill that's listed in here. Some of these I would call process learning versus outcome learning to be indicated. So more formative assessment than that summative assessment. Yeah, there is. I acknowledge that too. There's quite a bit of detail here.
Rebecca?
Just to pick on it too, I think we shouldn't assume that because the standard is broken out, that means that kids will be demonstrating it individually. I mean, it's funny you picked that one because I observed a fabulous physical education class where they were doing a series of relay tag games, and they were each designed to give kids a chance to use those different physical skills.
Okay.
And the teacher wasn't singling them out, but was just recording.
Right.
And it's about measuring your growing physical coordination.
That's
Krista?
helpful. Thank you.
I just want to pick up with the cost implications, because I know it's done for the agency, but what would that look like at the school level? And would this change, what would the cost implications be at the local level? And I just know, even as a teacher, when you get new standards, you have to take time to go through them and readjust the curriculum. So what would you envision that looking like?
Yeah, we really don't envision a cost not only for the agency but at the local level either. Rolling this out to schools is part of what we already do. We provide workshops and learning opportunities around standards, and especially now with the proficiency-based graduation standards and proficiency-based learning, we're already doing that, so this would be rolled into. I do agree with you that whenever there is something new, you do have to take time. I can speak for health, I can't speak for PE, but I know for health education, there's not much of a shift between the grade expectations and the National Health Education Standards. So they would have to tweak a little bit, but they don't have to totally reinvent their curriculum.
I don't know, just as a teacher, I know it might not seem like it, but it's a lot of time in that changing, so that definitely is a teacher's time taken away from doing something else. So, and maybe it's not economic, like maybe it's not money cost, but like the time.
And we also looked at this from teachers using their time more wisely, rather than revising the PE standards and the health standards within the state of Vermont, that they could be using their time to really focus on what's important, which would be the instruction and the assessment and moving to proficiency-based learning. Which the timing right now I think is a really good time for teachers, because we are shifting to proficiency-based learning. So if we're going to expect something new, I think this is a really good time to introduce this.
All right, yes.
Can I just ask Rebecca, because where's your vision then? Where do you see, because there are other areas too, like the social studies or art, like somebody came talk to us today, and how quickly do we envision all of these content areas having national standards in order to get the proficiencies? Are we going to do it one by one? Or, I don't know, I just look at, sometimes it gets a little confusing in the field. What should you be using? The Common Core, and then you have the GEs, and then some subject areas don't use the GEs. So what is the vision, or is there any document that sort of has the roadmap, which is replacing all? And if we're going to work on health and phys ed, are we going to incorporate some of these other areas too? Is that coming up, or?
They will. I mean, I think what what both of these individuals did was review the available documents, including what was in place currently and what the best practice is nationally to try to come to a good decision about what made sense for Vermont. And what we do at the state level is articulate, define the standards, and then provide support around interpretation of those standards so that educators in the field can then develop curriculum. And obviously that's a challenge for some systems more so than others. One of the advantages of using, if they meet our goals and really serve our Vermont vision of using a national framework, is that there's a lot more resources behind development of supporting materials, including formative assessments and curriculum ideas, so that systems that maybe don't have capacity can actually tap into that bigger and broader pool. But yes, I think we need to be continually updating our vision for what we want our students to know and be able to do in each of those critical 7 areas that are outlined. They're here today. I'm sure somebody will be before you in a little bit with something else in another area.
All right.
But it's better to move it when we think we're ready than to move it all at once.
Okay, I just wanted to see where we were headed.
All right, I think we'll handle this in 2 separate motions. Is someone prepared to make the recommendation that we adopt the National Health Education Standards?
So moved.
Moved by Sean Marie. Is there a second?
Got it.
Second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and we've adopted the National Health Education Standards. The second motion is that the Vermont State Board of Education adopt the Sharp American National Standards in grade level outcomes for K-12 physical education as standards. Is there such a motion being made?
So moved.
Moved by Sean Marie.
Second.
Second by Morgan. Discussion. If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and we've adopted both national standards. Thank you for your time and your presentation.
Thank you.
How have you been letting the field know? How will you let the field know?
Oh,
And will you include principals?
absolutely. Curriculum coordinators too. Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you still have that?
It will be ongoing for sure.
Okay, moving on to item N, strategic plan. Define nature of gaps. Sean Marie.
So this was tabled from last month, and it was the board's plan to take a look at some of the items on our strategic plan. This one actually fits into the strategic plan as well as the 2013-14 priorities, which were reducing the achievement gap, begin to develop different knowledge and white papers regarding priority topics for the board. So I saw on the Senate website that Rebecca had actually presented this very topic, so I had asked her if she would bring the PowerPoint so we could take a look at the same information that the Senate saw in looking at 361 when they were deliberating.
Harry, do you have it, or should I boot it up on this?
I have it on a thumb drive. I don't know if a thumb drive is going to work in that.
Do we have a document on?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Sorry.
Pay attention.
Agenda item number N, strategic plan, and I'll turn it over to the Madam Secretary.
Thank you. I noticed that all that talk about health made us need a break, but we're back.
Okay.
Maybe we'll move on to another agenda item.
Just trying to see if I had your attention. So I think the purpose of today, this session is, and it's great actually, now we're really going to be able to talk and dig into some of these issues. We've been talking a lot about equity, and every time I talk to various members of the school board, we talk about what equity is and how we'll know it if we have it. And I think the request came because the Senate Education Committee had asked me to come in and talk about the achievement gap. They wanted to know what it was because they kept hearing it in the newspaper, hearing people talk about it in the national press, and they wanted to know what the achievement gap was. So with them, I brought in some examples of some of the kinds of gaps that we typically see in terms of test scores. What I've done here is I've actually taken some of those out because you've actually had the chance to see those multiple times, but I'll give you some examples of other indicators that we're looking at, which give you just, I want to be very, very clear, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a number of issues here, but to share this not as a definitive picture or portrait of the equity gap in the state of Vermont, but a quick tour of some of the signposts that we look at that help us think about what the challenges of making sure, and to go back to what you said, Morgan, because it really is, it's about helping people take advantage of the opportunities. Equity isn't giving everybody the same thing. Some people need a little bit more support to even be able to eat at the table with the rest of us. And that's what equity is. It's making sure everyone has what they need to be able to be there with the rest of us, thriving and doing well for the state of Vermont. So with that, I'm going to show you some of the indicators that we're looking at that we think speak to how well we are or are not really addressing the challenge of making sure every child in Vermont is prepared to thrive in civic life and economic life. Now, some of these are a little confusing because some of these are taken from places where we gave our data, they created the tables, and their labeling is a little different from what you might have seen, so bear with me. These are this is a chart that looks at what we call a leading indicator. That is one that's currently under our control in our K-12 system. So it's a leading indicator is something that happens while we're educating kids, so we can start to think about, we might be able to directly influence it. And this one is graduation rates for economically disadvantaged and more advantaged children. And by economically disadvantaged, the gross proxy that we use is free and reduced lunch. Are these children eligible for food support compared to children who are not? And these are the graduation rates in 2013, and they're pretty similar moving forward. One of the things that we see in the data is that we actually peaked a couple years ago, and we are starting to see some softening in outcomes, particularly for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, which suggests that we are starting to experience some stress as a state around supporting kids, particularly in poverty. But what you see here, Vermont is the dark maroon set of bars near the bottom, and we have very, very strong graduation rates for our students who are from more affluent backgrounds. Almost 95% of our kids who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch graduate from high school. And that's very strong. That's among the strongest in the country. What we see and what we worry about is the fact that if you are living in poverty in the state of Vermont, your chance of graduating, or the probability of graduating, is closer to about 75%. So there is a real gap in leaving high school for kids from more and less privileged backgrounds in the state of Vermont. And when you think about the national data on the return on an investment in education, it's not just that the more education you get, the more likely it is you'll have a well-paying job, but that difference is sort of intensifying right now, so that the income gap between people with and without a high school diploma is growing. And so if you are not getting a diploma from a high school, your economic prospects are pretty bleak, and you have very, very few options for careers or for college at that point. So that's something that we are really concerned about. This is an example of a lagging indicator. This is something that comes after our kids leave school. And I like using both leading and lagging indicators. We can work on improving test scores. We can improve graduation rates. But the ultimate test isn't whether we improve those metrics. It's whether we've really prepared kids for life, broad, successful, thriving life beyond school, because that's what really matters. We're here to educate kids for life. We're not here to educate them for graduation and tests. The lagging indicator here is college enrollment for economically disadvantaged and advantaged children. And this really is something that's of concern. So this is a couple years out or a year out. We go back and we track data from the NCES, which polls kids who are registered in some kind of post-secondary opportunity somewhere in the United States, and we match them back to our kids. And what we see is that children who are not eligible for free and reduced lunch, in other words, more affluent children, are going to college. About 62% of them are enrolled in some kind of post-secondary opportunity. And if you look at that chart, you'll also notice that just looking at the New England states, that's sort of our benchmark set, we have lower post-secondary enrollment, even for children who are more affluent than our surrounding neighbors. That's food for thought in terms of what that spells for us, in terms of where we think we're going in terms of serving our kids well. But the one that really, really, again, concerns me is that 35% for kids who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So only 35% of our kids who graduate from high school and go on are enrolled in some kind of post-secondary opportunity, a year later. That's a pretty low percentage, and that should give us all pause. Go ahead.
Just to clarify, so is Vermont, are our state schools the most expensive out of the ones that are listed up here also?
This is national data, so these kids aren't necessarily going to Vermont schools. They could be going to New Hampshire and attending a school there. Yes, Vermont colleges may be expensive, and that may be a piece of this. There's also other issues as well. Right. And I think this goes back to Bill's point that when you see an indicator, we see this as a red flag, why it looks this way, there could be 20 different explanations. This is just an indication that we need to dig into this a little bit deeper with some qualitative data and try to figure out what's actually going on. But to me, the fact that only 35% of those kids are enrolled in post-secondary is problematic. It's hugely problematic, and we need to take the time to figure out what's going on and what's going on in different systems to try to figure it out. And you've seen in other slides that we know that that variability across systems is huge. There are some systems where almost everybody goes to college. There are other systems where very, very few kids go to college. So there's some equity there. We don't know what the driver is, what's actually causing that. That's something we'd have to go to a site and try to figure out. But again, it should be a cause for concern, and it raises a potential equity challenge for us as a state.
Where do we stand relative to the other states in New England in terms of the number of free and reduced students? How do we compare to the rest of the states?
We're a tiny bit lower than New Hampshire. I think there were 15, there are 14. We're about the same as Massachusetts, I believe, overall. We're low relative to the, this is the poverty, not the free and reduced, because our free and reduced lunch formulation is different. But in terms of child poverty, looking at the other statistics, it's low. I think we're pretty comparable, but I can double check on that. What I can tell you is nationally we are low, and we have much lower college attendance than some states that have higher poverty rates. So it's not, in our context, it's not just poverty. There's something else going on in addition to poverty, which is making some of our children less likely to go to school, to post-secondary. So again, it's a complicated issue.
I'm just curious if you have a similar slide for college completion. I'm assuming that it would look even worse, especially for our non-free and reduced lunch students, but I was just wondering if we have that.
I don't have one of those there. It's a little harder to track because they move. College it can take 4 years. It can take. We do have 4 years, 6 years, so on, and there's a lot of mobility. So I don't really have that, but it's a great question. I wanted to give you this also for English language learners. It's not a huge proportion of our population statewide yet, but it is one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the state of Vermont. And historically, it's been concentrated in a handful of locations, but what we're starting to see is that we are having increasing numbers of districts that are serving kids who are typically coming to this country and learning English for the first time. So this is a bright spot because this is where we're getting the growing population, and we really need that. It's a place though where we really need to be attentive to serving the goal of equity. And what we see, the leading indicator, graduation rates, and is that we're not really doing that well. I mean, this should really give us pause. The graduation rate for non-ELLs is higher, but relative to the ELLs, it's down at about 63%. So there is a gap here for ELLs relative to non-ELLs. English language learners in terms of graduation rates that we need to be attentive to, because if this is a growing segment of our population, we need to make sure that we have the kinds of support and specialized instruction in place that help them achieve their goals, develop competency in English so that they can go on and thrive beyond high school. One of the unique challenges that Vermont's had is that if you are in a more urban area like a Burlington, there may be enough English language learners in a system that there's specialized knowledge. There are teachers who are trained as teachers of English language learners. One of the challenges that we sometimes experience is that the presence may be so low incidence, or maybe so few ELLs in some schools that the school may not have that kind of specialized knowledge about how to modify instruction or be supportive in your instruction in ways that make it easier for those children to thrive. So a challenge for us in this small rural state, as this is a growing sector of our population, is to figure out how to push out support and expertise around supporting English language learners so that every system can support them effectively, and not just the ones who've had an opportunity to develop that skill. Another one I wanted to speak to, I'm going to give you a smorgasbord. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly because I know you're going to want to go home. But just in terms of, I did want to give you one test score map. This is the NAEP 8th grade math scores for Vermont, and I contrast it with Massachusetts here. One of the issues that we see in all of our data, I'll give you some lagging and leading indicators on students with disabilities later, but this is an area that we're really concerned about because one interesting piece about the paraprofessional study that just came out of the JFO was that we know that there are systems where perhaps our funding formula incentivizes certain kinds of special education innovations that may be more expensive but also less effective for students. And certainly you heard from Michael Giangreco, who talked about how over-reliance on paraprofessionals means that some of our students with disabilities, who truly are some of the most complicated learners in some of our buildings, are being taught by the people with the least skill. So one of the things that we worry about is, as a system, we are spending a tremendous amount in special education, but are we spending it on the right things? And is the way we're investing those dollars really creating better outcomes for kids with disabilities? And one of the things that we look at here is that there is a substantial gap. The two red lines are Vermont. The dashed line is students with disability. The solid line is students without disabilities. And what you can see is we do have a substantial gap. Now, there are issues around testing and using testing to assess disabilities. There are ways that sometimes these tests and the administrations are modified. So some of that gap may just have to do with how, when you have certain disabilities, you are able to demonstrate your learning, and this may not be the optimal environment for some students. But I threw up Massachusetts just to let you know that using some similar assessments or similar format assessments, there are other states that seem to have a narrower gap than we do, and it's just worth asking. Again, we don't know. We don't know what explains it. We don't know why. But this is the kind of question that we should be asking as we go around and do education quality reviews, just to systematically ask, well, what are the kinds of opportunities? What are the qualifications of the people who are actually delivering instruction to our kids with disabilities? And are we really doing that in the way that's most effective? Here's a leading indicator. These are graduation rates for students with and without disabilities, and you can see that we have the same type of issue with the performance gap. Students without disabilities, 90%. Students with disabilities, it's down around 68%. So again, we have that persistent gap for kids with disabilities in the state of Vermont. And the lagging indicator, did I not? I didn't advance. Oh, I think I put it in twice. Oh, this is college enrollment. I'm sorry, the header is wrong. That's the problem with doing this too fast. But this is the this is actually college enrollment. This is the correct header right here. I'm really sorry about that. But right down here, you can see that college enrollment rates for students with disabilities in particular are really much, much lower than students without disabilities. And again, part of that is figuring out how to make the college environment more successful and supportive. We just need to think about whether or not, if having access to some kind of advanced degree or some kind of professional credential that you might get through an A or a trade school allows you to access better quality jobs that pay you and are viable in the context of Vermont. We just need to make sure that all of our students actually have access to that. How we do that may be a complicated answer. I'm not saying this is easy or our systems would have figured it out by themselves long ago. What we also see is some variability statewide and ability to support improvements statewide. These are science scores, and what this map is showing you is, and I think I've shown this to you before, but this is the grade 4 science scores, and this shows the change in scores on the test from 2010 to 2014. And red districts are districts that had a decline in scores. These are at the SU level, by the way, because it was too small to do at this town level or the district level. But the SU level, areas in red are places where the 4th grade scores at the SU level in 2014 were between 10 and 7 points lower 5 years later. So one of the things, and this goes back to the whole role of testing and appropriate uses of testing and stakes and incentives and perverse incentives. This is science, which is not part of federal accountability. One of the things that we did wonder is if part of what we're seeing here is, as people really feel under the gun to raise those scores in English language arts and math, are we seeing a narrowing of instruction away from things like science, which we know are really critical to Vermont. We know if you aren't laying some kind of foundation in the elementary years, it's going to be difficult for kids to access higher levels of science instruction later on, if that's something we ought to worry about here in this chart. And clearly, if you're in a system that has weak or limited exposure to science, that becomes an equity issue. If that's your passion and it just isn't there, that's a challenge for you. So that's another way we might want to think about it. And I throw this up also to point out that under certain kinds of high-stakes accountability, the perverse incentives may be felt more strongly in systems that are more stressed than in others where you have fewer resources to reallocate. So the impact may be different in different parts of the state as well. And certainly what you see here is some of the places that are most hurt are tracking some of the places that we know are higher poverty systems in the state. And that's something that we're worried about. this is another way to cut data, and I'm doing this just quickly to show you how complicated the analyses are. One of the things that we know we need to do is build a more sophisticated way to use test scores, because unless you're really modeling for the effect of poverty, knowing a test score, what it really tells you is how many students in poverty the school serves currently. What we're really interested in is something more complex, which is how well the school is supporting the children and moving forward. What we did is we broke out here for the math, high school math kneecaps. We took the scale score at the school level. We broke our schools into 4 quartiles by school score. So the lowest scoring schools, bottom 25% on average, their mean score was about 32-33%. The highest scoring 25% of schools had a mean score on the kneecaps of just below 40%. So that's the total gap between schools in the state. The real gap is actually internally within schools. There's tremendous variability in performance within schools, and that's much greater than the gap across these different systems, though that is profound. This table I wanted to show you because I think it begins to introduce you to some of the relationships that are problematic and really reinforce the point that several folks made earlier, that really equity may be about compensatory support. And certainly that's the line the federal government is starting to take. When we take Title I, it's not about delivering basic instruction. The intent of Title I is to provide extra support to students in some of these historically disadvantaged groups to make sure that they actually can come to the table levelly. So the yellow bars represent the graduation rates, and you can see that the higher scoring, these are the same quartiles of school. The schools that are higher scoring schools have higher graduation rates. It makes intuitive sense. The other two, blue is the average percent free and reduced lunch eligible, and the red is the average percent special ed. So what you can see is that very, very clear relationship between poverty. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to have a lot of special education students, and the more poor you are and the more special education students you have, the less likely your kids are to graduate and the lower scoring you tend to be. It's that clustering of effects around each other. And that's really part of our equity challenge. And that's not an inherent quality of the schools. That's a function of sort of systemic inequity. And that's, I think, what our schools are trying to cope with. I threw this out because it just shows you how we often ask the wrong questions. But here is the issue of school size has come up quite a bit at the high school level, and what we do see is, on average, 4 again are the higher scoring schools, and they also tend to be the larger schools. So on average, the higher scoring schools are also larger, and that needs to be disentangled because there's a lot of other factors in there around population density and population affluence that's associated with size. An issue that I'm really worried about currently in the state is this issue of food security. We know that we have many systems where students depend on the school system for 3 meals a day. There was actually quite disturbing study that was done at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles recently by a doctor, a neuroscientist, who looked at brain surface area in children from the very poorest of families and from very affluent families, and found that there's a 6% difference in brain surface area, which is associated with executive functioning skill. And they controlled for genetics in the study, so what they concluded was that this could only be explained by systematic deprivation with respect to nutrition, basic health care, and opportunities to learn. That there's this interaction between the kinds of nurturing environment we provide from age 0 that actually doesn't just impair how much you know, it impairs the physiology you have to learn more. And that's really the challenge that I worry about. And here, this just shows you how challenging it is in a context where we don't have clarity around what our goal is with return to equity, how hard it is to make sure that kids really have the support they need. This is the same, this is all within one SU. It doesn't matter which one it is, because this is the pattern that you would see to greater or lesser extents. In this case, they happen to tuition at the high school level, but what the blue bars on the left of the red bar show are the percent eligible for free and reduced lunch at the elementary schools in this system. The red bar is the average for the SU, and the blue bar is the eligibility for free and reduced lunch at the high school. So these kids move systems for high school, and somehow we're not identifying kids as eligible for free and reduced lunch anymore, so they're not getting food support. So you think about that as an equity issue. Even when you think about the amount of growth that's taking place in adolescence, if those kids don't have access to food, that's a problem. That's a problem for all of us. And that's kind of the challenge in terms of equity, is how do we become a state where this is just something we do because we know it's the right thing to do for kids, and we don't do it begrudgingly, so that kids feel comfortable taking advantage of that opportunity. And that's a challenge for us. We need to think about how we're going to do that. Behavior, another way to cut the equity issue. One of the things that we do here statewide is that and I think Jill alluded, and I'm going to show you a slide that gives you some insight into that, is that we have profound challenges around behavior. We are seeing an increase in the number of students with pretty challenging behaviors who we really are struggling to maintain in class in ways that support their learning. This is just an example from some of our PBIS data in particular, but what we do see is that there's an equity issue around access to class and learning in systems that have taken a school-wide approach, a school-wide intervention around social-emotional learning, where aggressively, as an entire faculty, they're really focusing on developing that social-emotional cognitive construct to support and positively reinforce positive behavior, and schools that don't take that kind of school-wide approach. If you're in a school-wide system, on average, what we see is that there are fewer out of office referrals. If you have fewer office referrals, kids are not out of class. If kids are out of class, they're not learning. So this becomes an equity gap, and it is a concern to us because what we also see is that there is a relationship between level of poverty and the likelihood of lots of referrals to the office. So if one of the ways that we're coping with poverty is to move kids out of class for behavioral issues that might be attributable to hunger, might be attributable to lack of role modeling around positive social behavior in a home context, might be stress or trauma because you're exposed to acute stress at home. If the solution is to take those kids out of class, then obviously they're not learning because they're not in an instructional environment in the first place. So one of the things that we're doing, and you can see in the bottom, the exemplar schools, those are schools with really strong, robust school-wide interventions. The red bar is systems that are not quite so robust, but are committed to school-wide initiatives. And then the green bar is all Vermont schools all together, including those. And what we see is that the more robust the school-wide intervention, the fewer out-of-class interventions there are. And so we think about that as a possible way to think about equity as well. Go ahead.
Just to chime in, I think one thing that I've seen happen at our school my daughter's school has done a school-wide intervention with us, is that it's something that all students are participating in, and I think there's a different level of buy-in from all different socioeconomic factors, both children and adults. So it's not like, oh, these kids need, I mean, certainly not saying that for equity reasons you wouldn't give certain support to kids who need it, but I think the idea of all students benefit when we all have same expectations about how we're going to act or what the school culture is, whatever. And I think there's been a decrease, from what I've heard, in referrals to principal's office, whatever, but that also helps everybody, because every time a kid is sent out, that is disruptive too, even if you're removing the, I don't know, I'm just trying to say, I feel like this is one of the few equity issues that I feel like everybody can get a hand on. It's like, this is good for all of our kids.
Absolutely.
In a way that I think is maybe a different avenue for
Well, and
people
it's
who-
one of the 7, I mean, to me, it's part of that civic one of those 7 categories that were outlined in your education quality standards. You know, the school is where we learn how to work together as a community, all of us. It's, not just some of us. And so this is the place where you build that civic capacity, and I think having it be a culture system that involves all of you reinforces that. This is just to show you, I just wanted to show you a scatter plot, and I hope this is helpful. I'm just trying to give you the tour of what goes on in our brains. In any given week. The left-hand axis is the child count percent as a percent of ADM. Child count is the number of students receiving special education services as a percent of total membership, and the poverty line is along the bottom. So what you see is this relationship between poverty and the percent who are eligible for special ed. So what we see in the state of Vermont is that there's a clear relationship. It's not a super strong relationship, but it's definitely something that we know. And again, this is one of those indicators where you might stop and you might ask why. And I think any of you could come up with 5 reasons that might explain this. It could be that systematic deprivation actually create learning challenges for kids. It could be that this is how really strapped systems access resources to provide supports that a more wealthy system would be able to apply without specialized instruction. There are lots of reasons, but that should raise questions for us about a really fundamental equity commitment in the state. Are you raising your hand, Bill, or just?
Yeah, that's current percent. Your vertical axis is percent proficient.
No, this is.
I can't read it.
percent special ed, and then percent eligible for free and reduced lunch. No
Got it.
performance. We're just saying that if you're students that have schools that have more students living in poverty also have more students identified with disabilities.
That's a pretty strong correlation.
It's a pretty strong correlation. It should make us wonder. Increasing adversity, Jill alluded to this. I wanted to just keep putting this out there, and I've been starting to seed this into most of my presentations around the state, because this really, we are a wonderful, strong system. We have wonderful communities, but we have some real challenges, and what I am really hopeful we can do is put our heads together and protect what we have and make it viable for our kids. And here's some examples of why I'm worried. What we do see statewide is there are growing challenges around poverty and addiction, and that it's leaving our most vulnerable kids at higher risk for a whole host of health, developmental, behavioral problems. This is data that actually comes out of the Agency of Human Services. We look at it because it tells us what's coming our way. And what we see is that the number of homeless children is up 46% since 2010. The number of Vermont children in protective custody, it looks small, 1,145, but remember how few children we have in our system. It's up 15% this year alone, with a third of the year still to go in that metric. 41% of children in protective custody are between ages 0 and 5. Think about that. Okay, think about that. That's the cohort that's not even in school yet. And think of how vulnerable and how important we know it is in those years to have a stable relationship with a caring, supportive adult. So that's a real challenge. If you're in protective custody,
We talked about that.
it raises questions about the stability of your relationships with caring adults, and we know that that kind of reciprocal interaction is absolutely critical to neurological development at that age. We know that many more children are in families that are subject to conditional custody orders, but at risk. Conditional custody is typically based on you get to hold on to your children if you meet certain criteria. Often that's participation in some kind of rehabilitation program, and a state without enough capacity to provide rehabilitation services, that means those families are at risk if those parents can't keep it. Almost 60% of the children who had to be physically restrained last year were in grades K through 3. Physically restrained happens when a child's behavior is so out of control that we're worried they're going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else seriously. It's the last resort. It's a terrible thing to have to do. You have to be specially trained to do it, and it only happens because this child is going to get hurt. And that is happening more frequently for young kids, and again, that raises questions for us.
Is that by a teacher?
It's typically by a teacher or paraprofessional. It's an adult who's specifically trained to handle it. And Vermont is the state with the highest proportion of its population classified as emotionally disturbed or disabled. That is a statistic we really need to poke into. One of the questions I am hearing increasingly is whether it is truly that our children are emotionally disabled, or whether we are coding children as emotionally disabled when they are really victims of trauma and severe distress. And whether we really need to rethink how we support children who are living in severe adversity so that we're not calling them disabled when really what they need is social and emotional support.
Or
So we don't
given
know.
the study you just mentioned, if it's the students also with the lowest development of executive function, the lowest level of language,
Yes.
creating
Yes.
emotional outbursts that result in
Yes.
physical restraint. I mean,
Right.
we're labeling them when it's all of their
Well, it's really
surroundings.
instructional support, right? And that's
When they're-
the kind of if we really are committed in equity, absolutely, that's the kind of conversation we have to have, because to put that label on a child for life is a burden, and particularly when really in some of these cases these kids are they're also victims first, and they've been exposed to extremely challenging situations, and what we need to be doing is providing support in the least intrusive way possible. Fiscal equity, this was from the NCS study, that our response to the NCS study. What we know is that there is a slight percent difference between high and low poverty districts in terms of education spending per ADM. I'm proud of the fact that we are more supportive of students in poverty than most other states. I think Bill and others on this board have raised the question of whether we do enough, whether what we're doing for children who are really growing up in the most adverse circumstances is enough to let them come to the table with everybody else. And that's a conversation I'm sure we'll have over the summer and over the next couple of years. I just threw this up to be. What's that?
Can you go back one slide? We have the same tax effect regardless of whether you're a high poverty or low poverty district. Your reimbursement rate, if you will, is the same, but yet the poor districts continue to spend less, right?
this would suggest, that what Act 68 did was it equalized effort. So everybody has the same proportional ability to pay. And what we see is that the high poverty districts have a slightly higher spending per ADM than the low poverty districts.
Okay, I misread
So
that.
we are affirmative. We are spending slightly more per student in high poverty districts than we are in low poverty districts.
Then the question becomes, is that enough?
I think the question is that enough? That was exactly right. And then the other issue, there are some little wrinkles, and I just throw this up as an example. There are different ways that different communities also subsidize education over and beyond what they're spending off the education fund. This is an example. It's a small town, and there are some towns that, for example, have access to alternative revenue streams that underwrite the cost of education so that their ed spending may be low, but they may have other resources that they can bring in. This is a fiscal example of that, but it also could be community resources. When you talk about implementing Act 77 flexible pathways, how do you do a work-based internship in a very small rural town that has no business? It's just a different issue. If you don't have buses that get you to businesses in somebody else's town, you may not be able to realize the full power of some of those legislative tools. So, it's just, this is a complicated, as Bill said, it's not going to look the same in different situations because you're going to have a different solution. But the issue is, are we adequately accounting for it and making it possible for everybody? This shows the 4 different funding streams that this particular district has. It has federal forest revenue, it has federal impact aid, and between the 2 of those, that's about half their spending. Then they get a small schools grant that's about 8% of their spending, and then the ed spending is only about 43% of what they spend totally locally. What we did is we broke down, if you back out things like the small schools grants, the phantom students, and the federal impact and the forest aid, one of the questions we keep getting asked is, how do different systems spend? Because this has come up as an equity issue as well, and this gives you a sense. And the GORs and the unorganized towns, those are situations where they might have 1 student, 2 students, sometimes no students. We know that they are going to be more expensive on a per pupil basis. That's just a given, and that has to be that way. So they're on a different funding formula entirely. But what we do see is that even across different systems, there are some patterns. The most efficient system from an economic perspective, whether they're making the right choices, education is a separate issue. The cheapest systems are the ones that are union and union at both the elementary and high school levels. So those are unified systems. The most expensive systems are ones that tuition K through 12, and ones that don't operate in elementary but belong to a union at the high school level. That's just, when you start to back out those other things, that's the way it goes. And I think a piece of that is that you can't control tuition costs. You have to pay what the market's asking, and then you can't achieve scale perhaps in some of those systems at any other level. The least expensive systems are the ones that
Always goes on too long.
That was sort of my super quick tour of some of the issues that came up in the course of 1 week with respect to equity at the agency. We could give you several more, but I wanted to throw that out there to both as a way, partly because Jean-Marie had asked me to share and Bonnie had asked me to share some of the domains that we're grappling with, but also as a way of just introducing some of the complexity that we're trying to figure out how to grapple with in the education quality reviews. If we think that part of being an equitable system is making sure that every child has the basic needs met so that they can grow and flourish, then what does that look like in the context of an education quality review? If everyone has to be in a safe place where they feel supported, how would we know if that was happening?
Jean-Marie?
So, thank you, Rebecca. One of the things that Stephen just pointed out, it says discussion and vote. And really this was, I think, Perry puts it on there, so if we do vote on something, it's warned, right? But it was more, I think if we wanted to see everything for our discussion at the retreat, we'd be there for a week. So part of what I was thinking was leading up to that was this kind of a presentation for food for thought.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very good. So let's go back to...
Oh, no. Can I put another in here?
Okay.
So, can I put that in there now?
What? No.
No?
No.
Yeah.
Can we go back
That's
and
my
do the
job.
other stuff?
Sure.
We're building a stable.
Yeah, I think we'll leave that till last.
Okay.
Okay? thought that we had that agreement. Let's go back to agenda item K and talk a little bit about the board retreat. We're meeting on the 25th and 26th of June at Okemo. What time do we convene? I've forgotten.
Where is it?
6:25 and 6:26?
No, where?
Oh, in Okemo. Ludlow, Southern Vermont. I thought maybe this generation knew there was a Southern Vermont. I know the older generation doesn't.
He said awesome.
Oh, good.
He said awesome. He's excited.
I don't ever really get to see Southern Vermont.
Do you mountain bike?
When do we, 10?
9.
9? So we convene the first day at 9 and then we stay in the board retreat for a while in the morning on the second day and then have a quick board meeting. Is that what we usually do?
I think we'll have the board meeting on Thursday morning. We'll do that from 9:30 till about lunchtime at 12:30. Then this meeting would adjourn and we would move to retreat planning for the afternoon.
So we'd have the afternoon and the morning of the second day. Okay. All right. And I think there's probably...
Can you repeat that again, please?
We would have a board meeting on the 25th starting at 9:30.
Yeah,
And that would go to noon.
yeah.
Have lunch, and then in the afternoon, we would start the board retreat,
Yeah.
probably go to 5-ish, maybe a little later.
Yeah.
Have dinner, won't go into the evening activities. And then the next morning, 8:30 or so, 8:30, we would resume the board retreat and try to be done. I don't know, are you planning on staying for lunch or, yes? So we'd be there through lunch, but then leave after lunch.
Does it make any sense to try to tee up what we're going to discuss
Yes.
in advance?
Yes, that's what we're doing now.
Thank you very much. I'm just waking up.
Would somebody give
The
Peter a
agenda.
copy of the agenda?
Or,
So-
or coffee.
Yeah.
I was,
Espresso, please.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me that we're going to spend most of the retreat time on H361. But let me ask, before we get into that, are there other items that you'd like to cover in the retreat?
I would like to discuss how we operate as a board, both at these meetings and in our committees, and whether this mission ahead of us should be altered in relation to that.
You mean the board structure?
In terms of what our obligations and you know, what what I'm saying is I think we ought to give as much time as we can to the mission ahead of us, which is 361 and figuring out, you know, we have the Ledge Committee, we have these other committees, and I'm wondering if we can abbreviate or do
Well,
something to...
let me ask you, and I think that's a very good point, but I'm wondering if it happens in reverse. If we figure out where we want to go and then come up with a structure to manage that instead of trying to set where we're going to go to a predetermined
Yeah.
structure.
And part of that is what is really, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this, but what is the what are we really going to have to focus on and really get well-versed and prepared to deal with? And are we going to be talking about that at this retreat and really get some momentum going on this?
Well, that's my thinking, that we actually come up with a plan of how we're going to operate to help the agency affect this whole new legislation. And, I mean, I want to do it as much as possible with the agency. That's why I said this morning, I hope the agency will come to us with their thinking and how we can do this. But my thinking is that, you know, once we come up with the structure and the process at the June retreat, we go into action very quickly. Bill?
I think there's two things here. First is I wouldn't want to get too obsessed with H361, although I think it is vital, it's crucial, and we have to put a lot of energy into it. But I'm not sure that's all of our mission, and I think part of our mission, the center of our mission should be education, the quality of education, and things like these gaps that we just looked at. That is what we are here for, is to educate kids. And I would like to see two pieces. One is what are the programs we should discuss for the achievement gap issues? And we can talk about some of this stuff that we just looked at, but I think maybe go for solutions or some ideas on solutions. And the second is a work plan for 361. And both of these would require preparatory work by the lavishly staffed Agency of Education. Because I think that somebody in the agency is going to have to come up with this roadmap and list of activities that need to be done along what kind of timelines. Because if we don't do that, we could spin our wheels a great deal of the time. So if Rebecca could come in with a roadmap that we could review, that would help us do what you want to do, Peter. That is, define what we need to do when we need to do it.
I think that was the timeline piece Jill was talking about. Like that timeline piece that Jill was talking about, like going through and looking at the dates.
Task, timeline.
Yeah. And is that something that is the agency's responsibility, or is that our responsibility to go through the document?
I think...
looking at Rebecca, is that something
We can generate a timeline. I think it's in everybody's interest to go through the document, because I think
Yes.
the more
Oh, yeah.
familiar with each
Yes.
of you are,
Yes.
then the better any activity or conversation will be.
That would be, give us something to begin with.
I mean, I guess I would also...
The final copy isn't out yet, is it?
No, it hasn't been signed yet.
No, it's not a law enacted.
I think we can probably make some assumptions there.
Yes.
The second piece is, what are the programs that we should support in terms of the achievement gap? And I don't know where you are on that, Rebecca, in terms of being able to line out those kinds of activities, or what?
Do you mean endorse the programs? Or what are you thinking?
Identify them?
Like identify them and
Full-service
say, like, we
schools?
support these, or like, what are you thinking about when you say?
Yeah, we've got these gaps. What do we need to do for those things if we...
Like take universal meals, for example. You know, that's been on there. We know that universal meals, we've got this problem, the high school kids aren't applying for free and reduced. We know that it just doesn't disappear, but you have universal meals, and that could address one of those gaps right out of the gate,
Yeah.
for example. But it's going to cost money.
Unfortunately, most of the solutions do.
Right.
What are you talking about?
But is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Those kinds of...
But, for example, there's been several SUs that have had outside business consultants come in and evaluate their operations. We are leaving a lot of money on the table because we are not operating efficiently, even within the systems that we currently have. And part of it is just going back to this issue of how do we, when people are coming to us under 361 or something else, how do we provide some kind of guidance in terms of what the opportunities are to take your resources and target them at priority activities that help kids, and rather than on complex governance structures or excess bookkeeping or whatever it is that you have to do.
I know they're related, the achievement gap and the governance issues under H361, but is it realistic in parts of 2 days to think that we're going to get any further than what we want to do on 361?
Well, can we?
Yes, I think so, and I think that it's more important in some regards, at least in my value structure, that we talk about how do we educate all kids.
I'm kind of imagining, we used to have those like color transparencies where you'd have a sheet, you'd have like a red thing, and you put it on top, and it would reveal one thing. I almost feel like they're sorry, I'm so visual. I really want to crosswalk the two. I agree. I don't think there's enough time to be like, we'll do a morning on 361, and then we'll do an afternoon on pieces. But isn't one?
Yes.
Can we use what we want to see? Use our strategic plan. Use those equity goals as the way as we go through H261. Look through the lens through which we look at all of those governance questions. You could also make an argument, I guess, for the reverse. But I feel like the whole point of the strategic plan is that we really wanted it to be a tool. So I don't know. Is there a way to overlay those two things? I don't know if that's too simplistic. But
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think there's time.
Peter.
In depth for both.
My feeling is that if we don't get 361 done well, everything's at risk.
Yeah.
So what do you need to What do you need to have to know how to do 361 well?
Really know what is in the law and really know what our role is and really sort of play it out, how we're going.
And let me interrupt just for a second, and that we have a consensus and agreement. The last thing we want to do in this issue is have board differences, have one board member out here saying one thing and three-quarters of the board saying something else over here. We have been badly served by that in the past, that's why I really want to focus on 361 to see if we can come to a consensus and everybody buy into it, everybody give the oath that they bought into it, and we set up the structure and go from there.
I don't think there's a conflict.
Well, the conflict I've seen in the last 2 years with this board coming to a consensus on something and then individual board members going out in public areas and saying something very different, I think has done this board serious damage.
361, we've got a law, so we know what has to be done. And so it's just laying out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what are these things that need to be done and when they have to be done by. Basic planning.
But I think we can serve the purpose, and I think this is what Peter was saying, not to speak for him, I think we can serve the purposes of 361 by knowing that early, being aggressive, and getting out ahead of, if something is supposed to be done in 2018, there's no sense of waiting until 2017 and a half. It ought to start now, is my sense.
Well, we'll probably, within the year, for sure, be getting some governance structures coming to us.
Well, maybe we ought to be out there and encouraging that to happen.
And that's another thing, what is our role in that, in that situation?
That's a good
That's a
question.
good question.
Well, it's not specified in the law, I don't think, but with the agency, this is what I was saying this morning, with the agency, I think, one thing this board could do, whether it's a committee of the board or the full board, is start traveling around the state, talking to in various districts and say, hey, there's a major change happening here. What can we do to help you? We should know the area before we go to that meeting and have something we can suggest. We're not just there to listen, but I think that will help things in the end.
Just to add on to that, that was one of my notes is, would it be appropriate even to write letters to different SUs and SDs that we know are going to be facing challenges based on what's in the law and extending, like, we're here at the state board, this is what, to help in this process and extending those niceties early on in the process and not waiting.
I went around quite a lot to different boards and gatherings when 153 was being considered, and it was really productive for me and for us, and it was, I highly recommend it. And to get a really good lay of the land and realize what's happening at these district levels, nothing is the same. There's always.
But I want to make sure we do it in connection with the agency. I don't want us out there.
However,
and being perceived as trying to take over.
Yeah.
So that's why I was urging Jill and Rebecca this morning to give us as much of the plan as they possibly can in advance of the board retreat. Jean-Marie?
So I just would like to recommend that we also take a look at the strategic plan that we adopted. And part of that goes back to what in the rules do we need to be mindful of, some which were written in 1999 and 2001, to be able to successfully parallel what's happening with the new law. I really don't think, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I don't think 361 is a standalone issue. I think that the EQS, the standards, the reviews, all of that is part and parcel of, in part of that law, it talks about a well-performing school, which has to be tied to what we adopted last year. So
I don't think you can implement 361 without implementing EQRs well.
With that, with EQS, I think especially proficiency-based graduation requirements, in the field, that's really coming to everybody's trying to put things together. And I think as policymakers, we need to give them a roadmap. We're already doing it. And that's the thing is we keep adopting standards. It's going to change the work that's already been done. So if we can do that earlier rather than later, I think it's going to make that transition in the field. I know that zero cost, there is a cost. It's what we do over in our teacher trainings, which then we don't get to do other things. So there's a trade-off. There's an opportunity cost. But I think if we can look at the EQS and then really look at what are those standards that we're asking, which are going to be used to make those proficiency-based graduation requirements. So if it's...
That feeds into what Bill was saying earlier in terms of looking at the achievement gap?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you would, yes, because you need to have those standards in order to write those proficiencies. So even getting something, I'm not sure if the agency has this already, but in what areas is it the Common Core, the next generation standards? Now we have the health and phys ed, and when is it the GE? So like get a really lay of the land. And are there subject areas? Because I know Art was in here already talking. I don't believe social studies is represented at the agency either.
But we have in-house work groups working on social studies and art as well.
Okay.
It's in process.
But just so we get an update on that, I think that'd be really helpful.
What if we spent some time, when we start the retreat early Wednesday afternoon, on the strategic plan, on EQS, and with a background of H361, and then mid-afternoon on the first day started going into how this board is going to react with that background to 361, including what the structure is, what the operation is, and then at that point we would hear what the agency has planned, knowing that the plans will probably change over time, but come up with a beginning structure of how we go out and assisting with the implementation of H361.
Well, wasn't there some discussion that it may be 6 to 10, I don't know what the number is, that
We just don't know.
but I mean, wouldn't that be something, not to talk about it in particular, but to at least sort of, the
6 to 10 what?
Districts that may try to do that, the quick entry, with the extra incentives, and just look at that, look not at them specifically, but what kind of situations are we going to be dealing with as a result of this? I don't know. It's going to take some serious work to be prepared for this, and not. Anyway, I'm looking
I
forward
was
to it.
saying that one of the first things that the agency will have to do is do some orientations across the state, right?
I think we're already working and talking with the VSBA and the VSA around how to use their meetings to help support that, because
Basic information for everybody.
basic information. In fact, we'll be talking about the basic, and we'll be doing a run-through of 361. Jill's going to do a repeat of the Jill Roadshow tomorrow. The Jill Roadshow.
Is that yours?
I think those would be good things for the board to show some presence of.
I think that's great.
So let's
I'll pass it on.
we can't send emails to everybody, I guess, but if you've got suggestions or refinements of this conversation, send them to me and Rebecca, and I'll stay in touch with you, and we will make sure that we have a very aggressive agenda centering around this issue and making sure that we launch ourselves at the June board retreat. Yes.
So my suggestion is if it's okay with folks here, is that we try to get a facilitator like we had last time. Is that all right?
I don't think we need a facilitator.
She was great.
You don't think she was?
I don't.
She was awesome.
I thought she kept us all
She kept us
on the
on
same page.
task. I think
All right.
compared
Well,
to 2 years
at least I
I've
can
gone.
go outside more often. If you
And
don't
then-
want me facilitating, that's fine. Okay.
You need to participate fully.
No, that's all right. I'll sit there and shut up. I'm
And
fine.
then the other thing is, I was going to suggest that I submit to you a draft schedule based on the input that just came in, work with Perry to put together
Yep.
some kind of agenda.
Yes,
So that you can
that'd be great.
distribute as you
Yep.
wish. Okay. Okay.
Wonderful. All right, let's move on to the most important item on the agenda today, which is not really there. Wait a minute. I'm getting cut off. Can't lead a retreat. I can't finish the meeting.
We're having a tough
Not
day.
moving us along.
So, Vermont has really distinguished itself by having student members serve on the state board since the late 90s, I believe. And we've had some really dedicated, well-qualified students. And as you well know, students are here for 2 years, and we're losing a student. Morgan is off to another whole world, but in my opinion, she has faithfully served this board and represented the student point of view in many different ways. So, with that, my friend from Southern Vermont has come up with a little resolution that she would like to offer.
Actually, it was a joint effort.
And it's toys, is that what it
Wait,
is?
let her read the resolution first.
She can open it, she can open it.
Which
because she
do I open?
Oh, put the card aside.
Okay, all right. I was taught to start with the card.
Since she's young at heart, she's young at heart, but she's also so insightful. She, of course, went straight to that bag that was sitting in the back of the room trying to figure out what was in it, right? So,
I saw the frame and looked away. I didn't.
So the resolution reads, from Morgan McIver, whereas the state of Vermont has distinguished itself in the national education community by allowing students to serve on the State Board of Education since 1999, and whereas Morgan McIver has faithfully served as student representative for 2 years, starting in 2013, and whereas Morgan has had a distinguished education at Twinfield School, and whereas Morgan has studied beyond the regular high school curriculum and been an active member in the Youth and Adults Transforming Schools Together, which is YATS, where she was trained as a facilitator, and whereas Morgan took full advantage of the Renaissance program at Twinfield and studied several independent courses, and whereas Morgan has a broad interest in healthy eating, which has led to an internship at the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, where she became involved in the GMO legislation. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Vermont State Board of Education expresses its appreciation to Morgan McIver for her 2 years of service on the state board and wish her success in all her future educational endeavors.
So Sean Marie has made the motion. Is there a second? There's a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
It's passed unanimously. And Morgan, thank you very much. And do you have anything you'd like to say?
Thank you. I just really want to thank you all so much for this opportunity. It's one of the many that I've been lucky enough to afford, and it's all just helped me grow into the person that I am today. And I'm just so thankful. I'm really so grateful to have been here and spent 2 years with you all. It's really been a wonderful learning experience.
Great. And for us, too.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Motion to adjourn is in order.
So moved.
Make your last motion.
Oh, yeah. There we
Oh,
go.
second.
All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no. And the ayes have it. And we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Next meeting,